Chapter 1 of Old Friends, Essays in Epistolary Parody. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Old Friends, Essays in Epistolary Parody by Andrew Lang. Friends in Fiction, read by Betty B. Every fancy which dwells much with the unborn and immortal characters of fiction must ask itself, did the persons in contemporary novels never meet? In so little a world their paths must often have crossed, their orbits must have intersected, though we hear nothing about the adventure from the accredited narrators. In historical fiction, authors make their people meet real men and women of history. Louis XI, Lazarus, Mary Queen of Scots, General Webbe, Moses, the Man in the Iron Mask, Marie Antoinette. The list is endless. But novelists, in spite of Mr. Thackeray's advice to Alexandre Dumas, and of his own example in Rebecca and Rowena, have not introduced each other's characters. Dumas never pursued the fortunes of the Master of Ravenswood, after he was picked up by that coasting vessel in the Kelpie's flow. Sometimes a meeting between characters in novels by different hands looked all but unavoidable. Pendennis and David Copperfield came out simultaneously in numbers, yet Penn never encountered Steerforth at the university, nor did Warrington, in his life of journalism, jostle against a reporter named David Copperfield. One fears that the Major would have called Steerforth a tiger, that Penn would have been very loftily condescending to the nephew of Betsy Trotwood. But Captain Costigan would scarcely have refused to take a sip of Mr. Micawber's punch, and I doubt not that Litimer would have conspired darkly with Morgan, the Major's sinister man. Most of those delightful sets of old friends, the Dickens and Thackeray people, might well have met, though they belonged to very different worlds. In older novels, too, it might easily have chanced that Mr. Edward Waverley of Waverley Honour came into contact with Lieutenant Booth, or, after the 45, with Thomas Jones, or in Scotland Balmawhapple might have foregathered with Lieutenant Lismahagow. Might not even Jeanie Deans have crossed the path of Major Lambert of the Virginians and been helped on her way by that good man? Assuredly, Dugald Dalgetty, in his wanderings in search of fights and fortune, may have crushed a cup or rattled a dice-box with 4 gallant gentlemen of the King's Mousquetaires. It is agreeable to wonder what all these very real people would have thought of their companions in the region of romance, and to guess how their natures would have acted and reacted on each other. This was the idea which suggested the following little essays in parody. In making them the writer, though an assiduous and veteran novel reader, had to recognize that after all he knew, on really intimate and friendly terms, comparatively few people in the paradise of fiction. Setting aside the dramatic poets and their creations, the children of Molière and Shakespeare, the reader of novels will find, may be, that his airy friends are scarce so many as he deemed. We all know Sancho and the Don, by repute at least. We have all our memories of Gil Blas. Manon Lescaut does not fade from the heart, nor her lover, the Chevalier des Grieux, from the remembrance. Our mental picture of Anna Karenina is fresh enough and fair enough, but how few can most of us recall out of the myriad progeny of George Sand, Indiana, Valentine, Lelia. Do you quite believe in them? Would you know them if you met them in the paradise of fiction? Noun one might recognize, but there is a haziness about La Petite Fadette. Consuelo, let it be admitted, is not evanescent. Oblivion scatters no poppy over her, but Madame Sand's later ladies, still more her men, are easily lost in the forests of fancy. Even their names with difficulty return to us, and if we read the roll call, would Horace and Jacques cry adsum like the good Colonel? There are living critics who have all Mr. George Meredith's heroines and heroes and oddities at their finger ends, and yet forget that musical name, like the close of a rich hexameter, Claire Doria Foray. But this is a digression. It is perhaps admitted that George Sand, so great a novelist, gave the world few characters who live in and are dear to memory. We can just fancy one of her dignified later heroines, all self-renunciation and rural sentiment, preaching in vain to that real woman, Emma Bovary. Her we know. Her we remember, as we remember few, comparatively, of Balzac's thronging faces, from La Cousine Bette to Seraphitas Seraphita. Many of those are certain to live and keep their hold, but it is by dint of long and elaborate preparation, description, analysis. A stranger intermeddleth not with them, though we can fancy Lucien de Rubempré let loose in a country neighbourhood of George Sand's, and making sonnets and love to some rural chatelaine, while Vautrin might stray among the ruffians of Gaboriau, a giant of crime. Among Monsieur Zola's people, however it may fare with others, I find myself remembering few: the guilty Hippolytus of La Curée, the poor girl in La Fortune de Rougon, the Abbé Mouret, the artist in Louvre, and the half-idiotic girl of the farmhouse, and Hélène in Une Page d'Amour. They are not amongst M. Zola's most prominent creations, and it must be some accident that makes them most memorable and recognizable to one of his readers. Probably we all notice that the characters of fiction who remain our intimates, whose words come to our lips often, whose conduct in this or that situation we could easily forecast, are the characters whom we met when we were young. We may be wrong in thinking them the best, the most true and living of the unborn. Perhaps they only seem so real because they came fresh to fresh hearts and unworn memories. This at least we must allow for, when we are tempted to say about novelists, the old are better. It was we, who long ago were young and better fitted to enjoy and retain the pleasure of making new, visionary acquaintances. If this be so, what an argument it is in favour of reading the best books first and earliest in youth. Do the ladies who now find Scott slow, and Miss Austen dull, and Dickens vulgar, and Thackeray prosy, and Fielding and Richardson impossible, come to this belief because they began early with the volumes of the circulating library? Are their memories happily stored with the words and deeds of modern fictitious romps, and passionate governesses, and tremendous guardsmen with huge cigars? Are the people of, well, why mention names of living authors, of whom you will, are those as much to the young readers of 1890 as Quentin Durward and Colonel Newcome and Sam Weller and Becky Sharp and Anne Elliot and Elizabeth Bennet and Jane Eyre were to young readers of 1860? It may very well be so, and we seniors will not regret our choice, and the young men and maids will be pleased enough with theirs. Yet it is not impossible that the old really are better, and do not gain all their life and permanent charm merely from the unjaded memories and affections with which we came to them long ago. We shall never be certain, for even if we tried the experiment of comparing, we are no longer good judges. Our hearts are with our old friends whom we think deathless. Their birth is far enough off in time, but they will serve us for ours. These friends, it has been said, are not such a very numerous company after all. Most of them are children of our own soil. Their spirits were made in England, or at least in Great Britain, or, perhaps, came of English stock across the seas, like our dear old Leatherstocking and Madame Hester Prynne. Probably most of us are insular enough to confess this limitation, even if we be so unpatriotic to read far more new French than new English novels. One may study Monsieur Daudet and not remember his Sidonie as we remember Becky, nor his Petites Choses, or his Jack, as we remember David Copperfield. In the paradise of fiction are folk of all nations and tongues, but the English, as Swedenborg saw them doing in his vision of heaven, keep very much to themselves. The American visitors, or some of them, disdain our old acquaintances and associate with Russian, Spanish, Lithuanian, Armenian heroes and heroines, conversing probably in some sort of French. Few of us poor islanders are so cosmopolitan. We read foreign novels, and yet among all the brilliant persons met there, we remember but a few. Most of my own foreign friends in fiction wear love-locks and large boots, have rapiers at their side which they are very ready to draw, are great trenchermen, mighty fine drinkers, and somewhat gallant in their conduct to the sex. There is also a citizen or two from Furetière's Roman bourgeois. There is Magnon, aforesaid, and a company of picaroons, and an archbishop, and a lady styled Marianne, and a newly ennobled count of mysterious wealth, and two grisettes, named Mimi and Musette, with their student lovers. Monsieur Balzac has introduced us to mystics, and murderers, and old maids, and doctors, and adventurers, and poets, and a girl with golden eyes, and malefactors, and bankrupts, and mad old collectors, peasants, curés, critics, dreamers, debauchees, but all these are somewhat distant acquaintances, many of them undesirable acquaintances. In the great Comédie Humaine, have you a single real friend? Some of Charles de Bernard's folk are more akin to us, such as La Femme de 40 ans, and the owner of the hound Justinian, and that drunken artist in Gerfeau. But an Englishman is rather friendless, rather an alien and an outcast, in the society of French fiction. Monsieur de Camors is not of our monde, nor is the enfant du siècle. Indeed, perhaps good Monsieur Sylvestre Bonnard is as sympathetic as anyone in that populous country of modern French romance. Or do you know Fifi Vollard? Something must be allowed for strange manners, for exotic ideas and ways not our own. More perhaps is due to what, as Englishmen think, is the lack of humour in the most brilliant and witty of races. We have friends many in Molière, in Dumas, in Rabelais, but it is far more difficult to be familiar, at ease and happy in the circles to which Madame Sand, Monsieur Daudet, Monsieur Flaubert, or Monsieur Paul Bourget introduce us. Monsieur Bourget's old professor in Le Disciple we understand, but he does not interest himself much in us, and to us he is rather a curiosity, a character, than an intimate. We are driven to the belief that humour, with its loving and smiling observation, is necessary to the author who would make his persons real and congenial, and above all friendly. Now humour is the quality which Dumas, Molière, and Rabelais possess conspicuously among Frenchmen. Montaigne has it too, and makes himself dear to us, as the humorous novelists make their fancied people dear. Without humour an author may draw characters distinct and clear, and entertaining, and even real, but they want atmosphere, and with them we are never intimate. Mr. Alfred Austin says that we know the hero or the heroine in prose romance far more familiarly than we know the hero or heroine in the poem or the drama. Which of the serious characters in Shakespeare's plays are not indefinite and shadowy compared with Harry Esmond or Maggie Tulliver? The serious characters, they are seldom very familiar or definite to us in any kind of literature. One might say, to be sure, that he knows Hotspur a good deal more intimately than he knows Mr. Henry Esmond, and that he has a pretty definite idea of Iago, Othello, Macbeth, King Lear, as definite as he has, to follow Mr. Austen, of Tito Melema. But we cannot reckon Othello, or Macbeth, or King Lear as friends. Nay, we would rather drink with the honest ancient. All heroes and the heroines are usually too august and also too young to be friendly with us, to be handled humorously by their creators. We know Cuddie Headrigg a great deal better than Henry Morton, and Le Balafré better than Quentin Durward, and Dugald Dalgetty better than anybody. Humour it is that gives flesh and blood to the persons of romance, makes Mr. Lenville real, while Nicholas Nickleby is only a walking gentleman. You cannot know Oliver Twist as you know the Dodger and Charlie Bates. If you met Edward Waverley, you could scarce tell him from another young officer of his time. But there would be no chance of mistake about the Dugald creature, or Bailie Nicol Jarvie, or the Baron Bradwardine, or Balmawhapple. These ideas might be pushed too far. It might be said that only the persons in character parts, more or less caricatures, are really vivid in the recollection. But Colonel Newcome is as real as Captain Costigan, and George Warrington as the Chevalier Strong. The hero is commonly too much of a beau ténébreux to be actual. Scott knew it well, and in one of his unpublished letters frankly admits that his heroes are wooden, and no favourites of his own. He had to make them, as most authors make their heroes, romantic, amorous, and serious. Few of them have the life of Roland Graham, or even of Quentin Durward. Ivanhoe might put on the cloak of the Master of Ravenswood, the master might wear the armour of the Disinherited Knight, and the disguise would deceive the keenest. Nay, Mr. Henry Esmond might pass for either, if arrayed in appropriate costume. To treat a hero with humour is difficult in romance, all but impossible. Hence the heroes are rarely our friends except in Fielding, or now and then in Thackeray. No book is so full of friends as the novel that has no hero, but has Rawdon Crawley, Becky, Lady Jane, Mr. Jim Crawley, McMurdo, Mrs. Major O'Dowd, and the rest. Even Dobbin is too much the hero to be admitted among our most kindly acquaintances. So unlucky are heroes that we know Squire Western and the Philosopher Square and Parson Adams far better than even that unheroic hero, Tom Jones or Joseph Andrews. The humour of Fielding and his tenderness make Amelia and Sophia far more sure of our hearts than, let us say, Rowena, or the Fair Maid of Perth, or Flora Mackivore, or Rose Bradwardine. It is humour that makes Mr. Collins immortal, and Mrs. Bennet, and Emma, while a multitude of nice girls in fiction, good girls too, are as dead as Queen Tia. Perhaps, after all, this theory explains why it is so very hard to recall with vividness the persons of our later fiction. Humour is not the strong point of novelists to-day. There may be amateurs who know Mr. Howell's characters as their elders know Sophia and Amelia and Catherine Seyton. There may be. To the old reader of romance, however earnestly he keeps up with modern fiction, the salt of life seems often lacking in its puppets or its persons. Among the creations of living men and women, I, for one, feel that I have two friends, at least, across the sea, Master Thomas Sawyer and his companion Huckleberry Finn. If these are not real boys, then Dr. Farrar's Eric is a real boy. I cannot put it stronger. There is a lady on those distant shores, for she never died of Roman fever, who I may venture to believe is not unfriendly, Miss Annie P. Miller, and there is a daughter of Mr. Silas Lapham whom one cannot readily forget, and there is a beery journalist in A Modern Instance, an acquaintance, a distant professional acquaintance, not a friend. The rest of the fictitious white population of the States are shadowy to myself. I have often followed their fortunes with interest, but the details slip my aging memory, which recalls Topsy and Uncle Remus. To speak of new friends at home is a more delicate matter. A man may have an undue partiality for the airy children of his friend's fancy. Mr. Meredith has introduced me to an amiable countess, to a strange country girl named Rhoda, to a wonderful old Aeschylean nurse, to some genuine boys, to a wise youth. But that society grows as numerous as brilliant. Mr. Besant has made us friends with twins of literary and artistic genius, with the very highly cultured fellow of Lothian, with the son of Vulcan, with a bevy of fair but rather indistinguishable damsels, like a group of agreeable-looking girls at a dance. But they are too busy with their partners to be friendly. We admire them, but they are unconcerned with us. In Mr. Black's large family, the wop seems most congenial to some strangers. The name of one of Mr. Payne's friendly lads is Legion, and Miss Broughton's dogs, with their friend Sarah and Mrs. Moberly, welcome the casual visitor with hospitable care. Among the kindly children of a later generation, one may number a sailor man with a wooden leg, a Highland gentleman, who, though landless, bears a king's name, an Irish chevalier who was out in the '45, a Zulu chief who plied the axe well, a private named Mulvaney in Her Majesty's Indian Army, an elderly sportsman of agile imagination or unparalleled experience in remote adventure. All these a person who had once encountered them would recognize perhaps when he was fortunate enough to find himself in their company. There are children, too, of a dead author, an author seldom lauded by critics, who possibly have as many living friends as any modern characters can claim. A very large company of Christian people are fond of Lord Welter, Charles Ravenshoe, Flora and Gus, Lady Ascot, the boy who played fives with a brass button, and a dozen others of Henry Kingsley's men, women, and children, whom we have laughed with often and very nearly cried with. For Henry Kingsley had humour, and his children are dear to us, while which of Charles Kingsley's far more famous offspring would be welcome, unless it were Salvation Yeo, if we met them all in the paradise of fiction. It is not very safe, in literature as in life, to speak well of our friends or of their families. Other readers, other people, have theirs, whom we may not care much for, whom we may even chance never to have met. In the following letters from old friends, mainly reprinted from the St. James's Gazette, a few of the writers may, to some who glance at the sketches, be unfamiliar. When Dugald Dalgetty's epistle on his duel with Aramis was written, a man of letters proposed to write a reply from Aramis in a certain journal, but his editor had never heard of any of the gentlemen concerned in that affair of honour, had never heard of Dugald, of Athos, Porthos, Aramis, nor D'Artagnan. He had not been introduced to them. This little book will be fortunate far beyond its deserts, if it tempts a few readers to extend the circle of their visionary acquaintances, of friends who, like Brahma, know not birth nor decay, sleep, waking, nor trance. A theme more delicate and intimate than that of our friends in fiction awaits a more passionate writer than the present parodist. Our loves in fiction are probably numerous, and our choice depends on age and temperament. In romance, if not in life, we can be in love with a number of ladies at once. It is probable that Beatrix Esmond has not fewer knights than Marie Antoinette or Mary Stuart. These ladies have been the marks of scandal. Unkind things are said of all three, but our hearts do not believe the evil reports. Sir Walter Scott refused to write a life of Mary Stuart because his opinion was not on the popular side, nor on the side of his feelings. The reasoning and judicial faculties may be convinced that Beatrix was other than a good ane, but reason does not touch the affections. We see her with the eyes of Harry Esmond, and like him, remember a paragon. With similar lack of logic, we believe that Mrs. Wenham really had one of her headaches, and that Becky was guiltless on a notorious occasion. Bad or not so bad, what lady would we so gladly meet as Mrs. Rawdon Crawley, whose kindness was so great that she even condescended to be amusing to her own husband? For a more serious and lifelong affection, there are few heroines so satisfactory as Sophia Western and Amelia Booth, née Harris. Never before nor since did a man's ideal put on flesh and blood, out of poetry, that is, and apart from the ladies of Shakespeare. Fielding's women have a manly honour, tolerance, greatness, in addition to their tenderness and kindness. Literature has not their peers, and life has never had many to compare with them. They are not superior like Romola, nor flighty and destitute of taste like Maggie Tulliver. Among Fielding's crowd of fribbles and sots and oafs they carry that pure moly of the lady in Comus. It is curious indeed that men have drawn women more true and charming than women themselves have invented, and the heroines of George Eliot, of George Sand, except Consuelo, and even of Miss Austen, do not subdue us like Di Vernon, nor win our sympathies like Rebecca of York. They may please and charm for their hour, but they have not the immortality of the first heroines of all, of Helen, or of that Alcmena, who makes even comedy grave when she enters, and even Plautus chivalrous. Poetry, rather than prose fiction, is the proper home of our spiritual mistresses. They dwell where Rosalind and Imogen are, with women perhaps as unreal or as ideal as themselves, men's lost loves and unforgotten, in a paradise apart. End of chapter 1.
Chapter 1 of Old Friends, Essays in Epistolary Parody. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Old Friends, Essays in Epistolary Parody by Andrew Lang. From Mr. Clive Newcome to Mr. Arthur Pendennis. Mr. Newcome, a married man and an exile at Boulogne, sends Mr. Arthur Pendennis a poem on his undying affection for his cousin, Miss Ethel Newcome. He desires that it may be published in a journal with which Mr. Pendennis is connected. He adds a few remarks on his pictures for the Academy. Boulogne, March 28. Dear Pen, I have finished Belisarius, and he has gone to face the academicians. There is another little thing I sent, Blondel, I call it, a troubadour playing under a castle wall. They have not much chance, but there is always the little print shop in Long Acre. My sketches of mail coaches continue to please the public. They have raised the price to £1. Here we are not happier than when you visited us. My poor wife is no better. It is something to have put my father out of hearing of her mother's tongue, that cannot cross the channel. Perhaps I am as well here as in town. There I always hope, I always fear to meet her, my cousin, you know. I think I see her face under every bonnet. God knows I don't go where she is likely to be met. Oh, Pen, heret lethalis arundo, it is always right, the Latin delectus. Everything I see is full of her, everything I do is done for her. Perhaps she'll see it and know the hand and remember, I think, even when I do the mail coaches and the milestones. I used to draw for her at Brighton when she was a child. My sketches, my pictures are always making that silent, piteous appeal to her, won't you look at us? Won't you remember? I dare say she has quite forgotten. Here I send you a little set of rhymes. My picture of Blondel and this old story brought them into my mind. They are gazés, as the drunk painter says in Gerfaut. They are veiled, a mystery. I know she's not in a castle or a tower or a cloistered cell anywhere. She's in Park Lane. Don't I read it in the Morning Post? But I can't, I won't, go and sing at the area gate, you know. Try if F.B. will put the rhymes into the paper. Do they take it in Park Lane? See whether you can get me a guinea for these tears of mine. Mes larmes. Pen, do you remember? Yours ever, C.N. The verses are enclosed. The New Blondel. O ma reine. Although the minstrels lost you long, although for bread the minstrel sings, ah, still for you he pipes the song, and thrums upon the crazy strings. As Blondel sang by cot and hall, through town and stream and forest past, and found at length the dungeon wall, and freed the lion-heart at last, so must your hapless minstrel fare, by hill and hollow violing. He flings a ditty on the air, he wonders if you hear him sing. For in some castle you must dwell, of this wide land he wanders through, in palace, tower, or cloistered cell, he knows not, but he sings to you. The wind may blow it to your ear, and you perchance may understand, but from your lattice, though you hear, he knows you will not wave a hand. Your eyes upon the page may fall, more like the page will miss your eyes. You may be listening after all, so goes he singing till he dies. End of chapter 1.
Chapter 2 of Old Friends, Essays in Epistolary Parody. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Old Friends, Essays in Epistolary Parody by Andrew Lang. From the Honorary Cecil Bertie to the Lady Guinevere. Read by Christine G. Mr. Cecil Tremayne, who served under 2 flags, an officer in Her Majesty's Guard, describes to the Lady Guinevere the circumstances of his encounter with Miss Annie P., or Daisy, Miller. The incident has been omitted by Ouida and Mr. Henry James. You ask me, camarada, what I think of the little American donzella, Daisy Miller. Hestana Rosa, I may cry with the blind old bard of Tusculum, or shall we say, Hestana Margarita? Yesterday's Daisy, yesterday's Rose, wear it of Paestum, who values it today? Mais où sont le nugget de ton? However, yesterday, the day before yesterday rather, Miss Annie P. Miller was well enough. We were smoking at the club windows on the Ponte Vecchio. Marmalada, Giovanelli of the Bersaglieri, young Ponto of the Chio bis, and myself, men who never give a thought save to the gold embroidery of their pantoufles, or to the exquisite ebon lacquer of their Russia leather cricket shoes. Suddenly we heard a clatter in the streets. The riderless chargers of the Bersaglieri were racing down the Santo Croce, and just turning, with the swing and shriek of clattering spurs, into the Maremma. In the midst of the street, under our very windows, was a little thing like a butterfly, with yeux de pervenche. You remember, camarada, Voltaire's love of the pervenche. We have plucked it, have we not, in his garden of Les Germains? Nous n'irons plus en bois. Basta. But to return, there she stood, terror-stricken, petrified, like her who of old turned her back on Zoar, and beheld the incandescent hurricane of hail smite the city of the plain. She was dressed in white muslin, jolie comme une heure, with a myriad frills and flounces and knots of pale-coloured ribbon. Open-eyed, open-mouthed, she stared at the tide of foaming steeds like a maiden martyr gazing at the onrushing waves of ocean. Caramba, said Marmalada, violent gens fil pas trop bien gardé. Giovanelli turned pale and muttered, Corpo di Bacco, quaffed a carafon of green chartreuse, holding at least a quart, which stood by him in its native pewter. Young Ponto merely muttered, Egad. I leaped through the open window and landed at her feet. The racing steeds were within 10 yards of us. Calmly I cast my eye over their points. Far the fleetest, though he did not hold the lead, was Marmalada's charger, the Attis Gelding, by Celerima out of Sac de Nuit. With one wave of my arm I placed her on his crupper, and, with the same action, swung myself into the saddle. Then, in a flash and thunder of flying horses, we swept like tawny lightning down the Pintian. The last words I heard from the club window, through the heliotrope-scented air, 30-1 on Attis, half only if declared. They were wagering on our lives. The slang of the paddock was on their lips. Onward, downward we sped, the fair stranger lifeless in my arms. Past scarlet cardinals in mufti, past brilliant etira like those who swayed the city of the violet crown, past Piferari, dancing in front of many an albergo, through the ghetto with its marmorine palaces, over the fountain of Trevi, across the Cascine, down the streets of the Vatican we flew among yells of "Owners up!" the gelding winds hard held, from the excited bourgeois. Heaven and earth swam before my eyes as we reached the Pont Sublicia, and heard the tawny waters of Tiber swaying to the sea. The Pont Sublicia was up. With an oath of despair, for life is sweet, I rammed my persuaders into Attis, caught him by the head, and sent him straight at the flooded Tiber. "Va-t'en-donc, espèce de type," said the girl on my saddle-bow, finding her tongue at last. Fair or girlish modesty had hitherto kept her silent. Then Attis rose on his fetlocks. Despite his double burden, the good steed meant to have it. He deemed, perchance, he was with the Cuon or the barons. He rose, he sprang. The deep yellow water, cold in the moon's rays, with the farthest bank but a chill grey line in the mist, lay beneath us. A moment that seemed an eternity. Then we landed on the fair off further bank, and for the first time I could take a pull at his head. I turned him on the river's brim and leaped him back again. The runaway was now as tame as a driven deer in Richmond Park. Well, camarada, the adventure is over. She was grateful, of course. These Pervenche eyes were suffused with their dewy radiance. "You can't call," she said, "for you haven't been introduced, and Mrs. Walker says we must be more exclusive. I am dying to be exclusive, but I am very much obliged to you. So will mother be. Let's see. I'll be at the Colosseum tomorrow night about 10. I'm bound to see the Colosseum by moonlight. Good-bye." And she shook her pale parasol at me and fluttered away. Ah, camarada, shall I be there? Que sais-je? Well, this time to go to the dance at the Holy Father's. Adieu, carissima. Tout à voi. End of chapter 2.
Chapter 3 of Old Friends, Essays in Epistolary Parody. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Old Friends, Essays in Epistolary Parody by Andrew Lang. From Mr. Redmond Barry to his uncle. Read by Julia Niedermeyer. Mr. Redmond Barry, better known as Barry Lyndon, tells his uncle the story of a singular encounter at Berlin with Mr. Alan Stewart, called Alan Breck, and well known as the companion of Mr. David Balfour in many adventures. Mr. Barry at this time was in the pay of Herr Potzdorff of his Prussian Majesty's police, and was the associate of the Chevalier, his kinsman in the pursuit of fortune. Berlin, April 1st, 1748. Uncle Barry, I dictate to Pippi, my right hand being wounded, and that by no common accident. Going down the Lindenstrasse yesterday, I encountered a mob, and, being curious in Potzdorff's interest, penetrated to the kernel of it. There I found 2 men of my old regiment, Kurz and another, at words with a small, dark, nimble fellow, who carried bright and dancing eyes and a pock-marked face. He had his iron drawn, a heavy box-handled cut and thrust-blade, and seemed ready to fall at once on the pair that had been cheering him for his strange speech. "Who is this, lads?" I asked. "An Englander," answered they. "No Englishman," says he, in a curious accent not unlike our brogue, "but a plain gentleman, though he bears a king's name and hath Alan Breck to his by-name." "Come, come," says I in German, "let the gentleman go his way. He is my own countryman." This was true enough for them, and you should have seen the Highlander's eyes flash and grow dim again. I took his arm, for Potzdorff will expect me to know all about the stranger, and marched him down to the Drei Könige. "I am your host, sir. What do you call for, Mr. Steward of—" said I, knowing there is never a Scot but has the name of his kail-yard tacked to his own. "A king's name is good enough for me. I bear it plain, Mr.—" said he, reddening. "They call me the Chevalier Barry, of Ballybarry." "I am in the better company, sir," quoth he, with a grand bow. When a bowl of punch was brought he takes off his hat and drinks very solemnly. "To the king? Over the water?" I asked. "Nay, sir, on this side," he said, and I smoked a Jacobite. But to shorten the story, which amuses my tedium but may beget it in you, I asked him if he knew the cards. "I'm just daft when I get to the cards," he answered in his brogue, and we fell to piquet. Now my Scot wore a very fine coat, and on the same very large smooth silver buttons well burnished. Therefore, perceiving such an advantage as a skilled player may enjoy, I let him win a little, to whet his appetite, but presently used his buttons as a mirror, wherein I readily detected the strength of the cards he held. Before attempting this artifice, I had solemnly turned my chair round thrice. "You have changed the luck, sir," says Mr. Breck, or steward, presently; and rising with a mighty grave air, he turned his coat and put it inside out. "Sir," says I, "what am I to understand by this conduct?" "What for should not I turn my coat, for luck, if you turn your chair?" says he. "But if you are not precisely satisfied, I will be proud to step outside with you." I answered that we were not in a Highland wilderness, and that if no malice were meant no affront was taken. We continued at the game till, though deprived of my mirror, I had won some 500 Fredericks. On this he rose, saying, "Sir, in this purse you will find the exact sum that I am owing you. I will call for my empty spur in the morn. It was Rob Roy's before it was mine." Therewith he laid on the table a sort of goatskin pouch, such as Highlanders gird about the loins, and marched forth. I set to work at opening his pouch, that was fastened by a spring and button, seeming easy enough of access. But I had scarce pressed the button, when lo, a flash, a pistol shot, and my right hand is grazed with a bullet that flew out of the bag. This Highlander of the devil had some mechanism in his purse that discharged a small steel pistol when unwarily opened. My hand is but slightly wounded, yet I cannot hold my sword, nor have my search brought me any news of Alan Breck. He has vanished like an emissary of the devil, or the Pretender, as I doubt not he is. But I will have his blood, if he is not one of the Scotch fairies. Your loving nephew, Redmond Barry of Ballybarry. P.S. The Fredericks were in the bag, all told. End of Chapter 3. Recording by Julia Niedermeyer.
Chapter 4 of Old Friends. Essays in Epistolary Parody. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Old Friends. Essays in Epistolary Parody by Andrew Lang. From Mrs. Gamp to Mrs. Prig. Read by Dielenovka. Mrs. Gamp nurses an old friend who is under a singular delusion. Todgers. My precious Betsy, which when last we parted, it was not as I could wish, but bearing malice in our hearts. But as often and often Mrs. Harris have said it before me, with the tears in her angel eyes, one of them having a slight cast from an accident with the moderator lamp. Harris, being quick in his temper, often and often have she said to me, "Ah, Sary, the quarrels of friends is affection's best restorer." And good reason to know it she have, with a husband as was ever true, and never gave her no cause to form the wish to pisen them as has good looks, but, for I will not deceive you, ready with his hands. And so between you and me may it be, Betsy Prig, as was constant partners afore them Chuzzlewidges and Nadgets and Loosemses and Tiggses and Chuffies got that mixed, and that aggravating that to remember who of them poisoned which, and for why in a slime draught, it makes my poor head go round. Nor could such be soothing to the temper. So let bygones be bygones between us. For, wanting of my Betsy, I am now in a nice state of confusion, with a patient, as was well beknown to me in my younger days, when there wasn't so much of a shadow on this mortal vial, meaning Mr. Pecksniff, which you will not forget of him, by reason of his daughter, as married that Jonatch, and his collars, as mints of money, must have gone to the getting them up, but is now at Todger's, and confused in his poor mind, thinking himself somebody else high in Parliament, and wonder at it I do not, them Chuzzlewidges and Chuffies being that distracting, and ever proving to be some other person in disguise, as would confudge a calculating boy. So, being applied to for to nightly him, there in that very sick room, for why should I deceive you, I meets the daily nuss, and Betsy, I was that overcome to have such a partner proposed to me, as I had to ring and ask the young woman immediate for a small glass of their oldest rum, being what I am not accustomed to, but having had a turn. For will you believe it, she was not a widger woman, as has experience in the ways of men, but a hussy, in a Bruggian cap, like them nuns wear in Maria Monk, as you may have seen it in the small sweet shops, at a penny, and her hands as white as her papistry cap, and a turning up of her nose at what I had took, and presuming to give me advice about nothing, as St. Pancrage's churchyard wouldn't hold them I've seen comfortable to their long homes, and no complaints made, but ever the highest satisfaction. So I ups and gives her a bit of my mind, and Mrs. Todgers, coming down, "It's she goes or me," says I, "for never will Sary Gamp nuss, sick or monthly, with a partner as has not confidence in me, nor I in her, but contrary." Then she says she'll go and speak to the doctor about it, and out she tramps with her nose in the air, and sneezing most awful, not being accustomed to that which I take find it strengthening. But as it has been a cause of sorrow and strife, let it be nameless between you and me, for to have the name Snuffy brought forward, it is what the heart can forgive, but never forget, in this valley of the Shaddock. I have nursed a many lunacies, Betsy, and in a general way I am disposed to humour them, rather than set them right up again the fire when fractious. But this Pecksniff is the tryingest creature. He have got it in his mind, as he is somebody very high, and talking about the house, and bills, and clauses, and the sacred cause of universal anarchy, for such was his Bible language, though meaning to me no more than the babe unborn, whereby Mrs. Harris, she have often said to me, "What do them blessed infants occupy their little minds with afore they are called into that condition where, unless changed at nuss, Providence have appointed them?" And many a time I have said, "Seek not, Mrs. Harris, to discover, for we know not what's hidden in our own hearts, and the tortures of the imposition should not make me divulge it." But Pecksniff is that aggravating, as I can hardly heed the words I now put on the paper. "Some of my birds have left me," says he, "for the stranger's breast, and one have took wing for the government benches. But I have ever sacrificed my country's happiness to my own, and I will not begin to regulate my life by other rules of conduct now. I know the purity of my own motives, and while my Mary, my little Sir William, playful warbler, prattles under this patriarchal wing, and my Cherry, my darling Morley, supports the old man's tottering walk, I can do without my Goshy, my dears, I can do without him. And wants to borrow my umbrella for them to rally around, the Bruggian idjot. A chattering creature he always were, and will be, but Betsy, I have this very moment fixed him with a shoehorn in his mouth, as was lying around providential, and the strings of my bonnet, and the last word as he will say this blessed night was some lunacy about denouncing the clergy, as won't give much more trouble now. So, having rung for a shilling's worth of gin and water warm, wishing you was here to take another of the same, I puts my lips to it, and drinks to one as was my frequent partner in this mortial vale, and am, as in old days, my Betsy's own, Sary Gamp. End of Chapter 4. Recording by Dielenovka.
Chapter 5 of Old Friends, Essays in Epistolary Parody. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Avaí in July 2015. Old Friends, Essays in Epistolary Parody by Andrew Lang. From Herodotus of Halicarnassus to Sophocles the Athenian. Herodotus describes, in a letter to his friend Sophocles, a curious encounter with a mariner just returned from unknown parts of Africa. To Sophocles the Athenian, greeting. Yesterday, as I was going down to the market-place of Naucratis, I met Nicaretê, who of all the Hetairæ in this place is the most beautiful. Now the Hetairæ of Naucratis are wont somehow to be exceedingly fair, beyond all women whom we know. She had with her a certain Phocian mariner, who was but now returned from a voyage to those parts of Africa which lie below Arabia, and she saluted me courteously, as knowing that it is my wont to seek out and inquire the tidings of all men who have intelligence concerning the ends of the earth. Hail to thee, Nicaretê, said I. Verily thou art this morning as lovely as the dawn, or as the beautiful Rhodopis that died ere thou wert born to us through the favour of Aphrodite. Now this Rhodopis was she who built, they say, the pyramid of Mycerinus, wherein they speak not truly but falsely, for Rhodopis lived long after the kings who built the pyramids. Rhodopis died not, O Herodotus, said Nicaretê, but is yet living, and as fair as ever she was. And he, who is now my lover, even this Phanes of Phocaea, hath lately beheld her. Then she seemed to me to be jesting, like that scribe who told me of Crophi and Mophi, for Rhodopis lived in the days of King Amasis and of Sappho the minstrel, and was beloved by Charaxus, the brother of Sappho, wherefore Sappho reviled him in a song. How then could Rhodopis, who flourished more than 100 years before my time, be living yet? While I was considering these things, they led me into the booth of one that sold wine, and when Nicaretê had set garlands of roses on our heads, Phanes began and told me what I now tell thee, but whether speaking truly or falsely, I know not. He said that being on a voyage to Punt, for so the Egyptians call that part of Arabia, he was driven by a north wind for many days, and at last landed in the mouth of a certain river where were many seafowl and water birds. And thereby is a rock, no common one, but fashioned into the likeness of the head of an Ethiopian. There he said that the people of that country found him, namely the Amagardoi, and carried him to their village. They have this peculiar to themselves, and unlike all other peoples whom we know, that the women ask the man in marriage. They then, when they have kissed each other, are man and wife wedded. And they derive their names from the mother, wherein they agree with the Lycians. Whether being a colony of the Lycians, or the Lycians a colony of theirs, Phanes could not give me to understand. But whereas they are black and the Lycians are white, I rather believe that one of them has learned this custom from the other, for anything might happen in the past of time. The Amargardoi have also this custom, such as we know of none other people, that they slay strangers by crowning them with amphorae, having made them red hot. Now, having taken Phanes, they were about to crown him on this wise, when there appeared among them a veiled woman, very tall and goodly, whom they conceived to be a goddess and worship. By her was Phanes delivered out of their hands, and she kept him in her hollow caves, having a desire that he should be her lover, as Homer says in the Odyssey, if the Odyssey be Homer's. And Phanes reports of her that she is the most beautiful woman in the world, but of her coming thither, whence she came or when, she would tell him nothing. But he swore to me, by him who is buried at Thebes, and whose name in such a matter as this is not holy for me to utter, that this woman was no other than Rhodopis the Thracian. For there is a portrait of Rhodopis in the temple of Aphrodite in Naucratis, and, knowing this portrait well, Phanes recognized by it that the woman was Rhodopis. Therefore Rhodopis is yet living, being now about 150 years of age. And Phanes added that there is in the country of the Amargardoi a fire, and whoso enters into that fire does not die, but is without age and immortal, as Homer says concerning the horses of Peleus. Now I would have deemed that he was making a mock of that sacred story, which he knows who has been initiated into the mysteries of Demeter at Eleusis. But he and Nicaretê are about to sail together without delay to the country of the Amargardoi, believing that there they will enter the fire and become immortal. Yet methinks that Rhodopis will not look lovingly on Nicaretê when they meet in that land, nor Nicaretê on Rhodopis. Nay, belike the amphora will be made hot for one or the other. Such, howbeit, was the story of Phanes the Phocian, whether he spoke falsely or truly. The God be with thee. Herodotus. End of chapter 5.
Chapter 6 of Old Friends, Essays in Epistolary Parody. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Old Friends, Essays in Epistolary Parody by Andrew Lang. Mrs. Proudie, wife of the Bishop of Barchester, admits Mrs. Quiverful into her confidence. Mrs. Proudie first takes pleasure in a new and pious acquaintance, Lady Crawley, née Sharp, but afterwards discovers the true character of this insidious and dangerous woman. The Palace, Barchester, July 17. Dear Laetitia, the appearance of mumps in a small family of 14 like yours is indeed one of those dispensations which teach us how mysterious are the ways. But I need not tell you to be most careful about cold, which greatly adds to the virulence of the complaint, and it is difficult for you, in lodgings at Brighton, to keep a watchful eye on so many at once. May this discipline be blessed to you and to the dear children. I have much to tell you of Barchester. The light worldly tone of some families in this place, I will not mention the Grantleys nor the Arabins, has been checked, I hope, by one of those accidents which surely are not to be considered accidents alone. You know how strong is my objection to fancy fairs or bazaars, too often rather scenes of giddy merriment than exhibitions of genuine Christian feeling. Yet by means of one of these, how strangely are things ordered, a happy change, I trust, is being brought about in our midst. You have heard of Hogglestock, though you may never have visited that benighted and outlying parish. Indeed, I was never there myself till last week, when Tom felt it his duty, though woefully misdirected to my mind, but we are fallible creatures, to go and open a bazaar in that place for the restoration of the church. I accompanied him, for I trusted that an opportunity might be made for me, and that I might especially bear in on the mind of the rector's wife the absolute necessity of Sabbath-day schools. The rector is a Mr. Crawley. He led us on our arrival into a scene of red cloth, wax dolls most indelicately displayed, cushions, antimacassars, and similar idols. The bishop's speech (I composed it myself) you will read in the Barchester Guardian, which I send you. While approving the end, he rebuked the means, and took the opportunity to read a much-needed lesson on Jesuitry and the dangers of worldliness in high ecclesiastical places. Let those wince who feel a sense of their own backslidings. When the bishop had ended, I determined to walk once through the bazaar just to make sure that there were no lotteries nor games of chance, a desecration of our mites now too frequent. As I was returning through the throng, alas, of pleasure-seekers, and wishing that I might scourge them out of the schoolroom, Mr. Crawley met me, in company with a lady who desired, he said, to be presented to me. He is a distant relation of the well-known county family, the Crawleys, of Queen's Crawley, the present baronet, Sir Rawdon, having recently married Miss Jane Dobbin, daughter of Colonel Dobbin. The lady who was now introduced to me, and whose still pleasing face wears an aspect of humble devoutness, was Lady Crawley, mother of the present baronet. "Madam," she said, "I came here in the belief that I was discharging a pious duty. My life, alas, has been one of sore trial, and I only try to do good." I was going to say that I had seen her name in a score of charity lists, and knew her as a patroness of the destitute orange girls, the neglected washerwomen, and the distressed muffin-men. But she shook her head, and then, looking up at me with eyes like a saint's, if our privileges permitted us to believe in these fabulous beings of the Romish superstition, she said, "Ah, no, I've always been in the wrong. The beautiful address of the Bishop of Barchester has awakened me, and convinced me that the path does not lie through fancy fairs. I have to begin again. Who shall guide me?" I trust I am not subject to vanity, but the news that for I composed the charge, as I may almost call it, had been the instrument of so affecting a change, did not fail to please me. I thanked Lady Crawley, and expressed my deep interest in her altered convictions. Finally she promised to come on a visit to us at the palace (she usually resides at Bath or Cheltenham), and has been 3 days an inmate. Never have I met a more singular example of what the truth can do for one who, as she admits, was long ago a worldling. "I have seen the vanity of it," she tells me, with tears in her eyes, "and from her example I expect an awakening among our worldlings. They will follow the path of a titled person. Tom is much interested in his convert, as he thinks her. Not to me be the glory. Your assured friend, Emily Barnum." From Mrs. Proudie to Mrs. Quiverful, The Palace, Barchester, July 22nd. Dear Laetitia, my hand trembles so with indignation that I can hardly direct my pen. Pray burn my letter of July 17 at once, if you have not already done so. We have been deceived in that woman. She is a brazen-faced, painted daughter of Heth, and has no more right to the title of Lady Crawley than you have. I am told that she was at one time the paramour of Lord Steyne, and that her conduct made it impossible for her husband to live with her. And this is the woman who has come within the gates of the palace of a Christian prelate. nay, more, who has secured his signature to a cheque of very considerable value. I think my suspicions were first excited by the disappearance of the brandy in the liqueur stand, and by meeting her ladyship's maid carrying the bottle up to her room. I spoke to the bishop, but he would not listen to me, quite unlike himself, and even turned on me in her defence. Entering his study hastily on the following day, I found her kneeling at his feet, her yellow hair dyed, no doubt, for she must be 60 if she is a day, about her shoulders, doing, what do you suppose? Confessing herself to the Bishop of Barchester. And he was listening to her confession with an appearance of interest, and with one of her hands in his. "Serpent," I said, and her green eyes glittered just like one, "unhand his lordship." She gave a little laugh, and said, "Dear Mrs. Proudie, do not let me monopolize the bishop's time. Perhaps I am in the way." "And you shall go out of it," I said. "You're one of those who cause Israel to sin. You bring the confessional, for it is no better, into the house of a prelate of the Protestant Church of England." Would you believe that she had the assurance to answer me with a passage from the prayer book, which I have often felt certain must be mistranslated? "Pack, madam," said I. "We know who can quote Scripture for his own ends." And I pretty soon saw her out of the house, though not in time, for the infatuated bishop had already given her a cheque for a sum which I cannot bring myself to tell you, for the fund of the destitute orange girls. Not a penny of it will they ever see, nor do I approve of such ostentatious alms in any case. Yours in haste, Emily Barnum. P.S. I have heard from Lady Courtenay all her history. It is abominable. End of chapter 6. Recording by Anna Simon.
Chapter 7 of Old Friends, Essays in Epistolary Parody. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Old Friends, Essay in Epistolary Parody by Andrew Lang. From Robert Surtees, Esquire of Mainsforth, to Jonathan Oldbuck, Esquire of Monkbarns. Read by Christine G. It is well known that Mr. Surtees of Mainsforth not only palmed off on Sir Walter Scott several ballads of his own manufacture, but also invented and pretended to have found in a document, since burned, the story of the duel with the Spectre Knight, which occurs in Marmion. In the following letter this ingenious antiquary plays the same game with Mr. Jonathan Oldbuck of Monkbarns, the celebrated antiquary. A note on the subject is published in the appendix. Mainsforth, May 9th, 1815. Dear Sir, I am something of the Mussulman's humour, as you know, and never willingly pass by a scrap of printed paper, however it comes in my way. I cannot, indeed, like the Spectator, mention a paper kite from which I have received great improvement, nor a hat case which I would not exchange for all the beavers in Great Britain. It is in a less unlikely place that I have made a little discovery, which will interest you, I hope, for as it chances, not only has a lost ballad been at least partially recovered, but— However, I will keep your learned patience on the tenterhooks for a while. Business taking me to Newcastle of late, I found myself in Bell's little shop on the quay. You know the man, by report at least. He is more a collector than a bookseller, though poor, and I verily believe that he would sell all his children, Douglas Bell, Percy Bell, Hobby Bell, and Kinmont Bell, for a song. Ballads are his foible, and he can hardly be made to part with one of the broadsides in his broken portfolios. Well, semel in sanivimius omnes. By the way, did it ever strike you that the Roman cribbed that line, as the vulgar say, from an epigram in the Anthology? And you and I will scarce throw the first stone at the poor man's folly. However, I am delaying your natural eagerness. So now for the story of my great discovery. as our friend Bell would scarce let his dusty broadsheet lumber out of his hands, I was turning to leave him in no very good humour, when I noticed a small and rather long octavo, in dirty and crumpled vellum, lying on the top of a heap of rubbish, Boston's Crook in the Lot, The Pilgrim's Progress, and other chap-book trumpery. I do not know what good angel that watches over us collectors made me take up the thing, which I found to be nothing less than a copy of old Guillaume Coquillard. It was not Galop de Presse edition, in lettres rondes, but, still more precious had it only been complete, an example in black letter. I give you the whole title. First a motto, in the frieze of an architectural design, Agatha Thackeray. Then, in small capitals, Les Ouvres, Maistre Gville, Loim Coquille, L'Artenson Vie, Vente Vigéal, De Reims Neuve, Vellemont Reux, Veuve Corée, Gise. 1835. Au levant à Lyon et là, Maison de François Jusdet, de Morin de Van Nostre, Dame de Confort. By bad, or good, luck, this rare piece was imperfect, the back gaping and 3 sheets gone. But, in turning over the leaves, I saw something that brought my heart, as they say, into my mouth. So, beating down Bell from his upset price of 4d to 6 bobbies, I pushed the treasure carelessly in my pocket, and never stopped till I was in a lonely place by Tuneside, and secure from observation. Then, with my knife, I very carefully uncased Master Choulion, and extracted the sheet of parchment, printed in black letter with red capitals, that had been used to line the binding. A corner of it had crept out, through the injuries of time, and on that, in Bell's crameur, for it is more a crameur than a shop, I had caught the mystic word, Runit macht gut. And now, I think, Monkbarns, you prick up your ears and wipe your spectacles. That is the motto, as every one of the learned family of antiquaries is well aware, and, as you have often told me of your great forbear, the venerable and praiseworthy Aldobrand Oldenbuck, the typographer, who fled from the Low Countries during the tyrannical attempt of Philip II, to suppress at once civil and religious liberty. As all the world knows, he withdrew from Nuremberg to Scotland, and set up his penates, and, what you may not hitherto have been aware of, his printing press at Fairport, and under your ancestral roof of Monkbarns. But, what will surprise you yet more, the parchment sheet which bears Aldobrand's motto in German contains printed matter in good Scots. The excellent and enterprising man must have set himself to ply his noble art in his new home, and in our unfamiliar tongue. Yet, even now, we are not at the end of this most fortunate discovery. It would appear that there was little demand for works of learning and religion in Scotland, or at least at Fairport, for the parchment sheet contains fragments of a ballad in the Scots tongue. None but a poor and struggling printer would then have lent his types to such work, and fortunate for us has been the poverty of your great ancestor. Here we have the very earliest printed ballad in the world, and, though fragmentary, it is the more precious as the style proves the demonstration, and against the frantic scepticism even of Aritzon, the antique and venerable character of those compositions. I send you a copy of the ballad, with the gaps, where the tooth of time, or of the worm, edax rerum, hath impaired it, filled up with conjectural restorations of my own. But how far do they fall short of the original simplicity? Non cuivis contigit. As the title is lacking, as well as the imprint, I have styled it, The Fragment of the False Lover and the Dead Lemon. O Willie rade and Willie gaed atween the shore and sea, and still it was his dead lady that kept him company. O Willie rade and Willie gaed atween the loch and heather, and still it was his dead lady that held his stirrup leather. O Willie, take me up by ye, sae far it is I gang. O take me on your saddle bow, or your day shall not be lang. Gae back, ye false ill wife, to the grave wherein ye lie. It never was seen that a dead leman kept lovers company. Gae back, for me, he said, for this day morn I wed, And how can I kiss a living lass, when ye come from the dead? If ye maun't haunt a living man, you brither haunt, says he, for it was never my knife but his, that twined thy life and thee. We are to understand, I make no doubt, that Willie had been too fortunate a lover, and that in his absence, the frailty of his lady becoming conspicuous, her brother had avenged the family honour according to that old law of Scotland, which the courteous Aristo styles L'aspra legge di Scotia, empia e severa. Pray let me know, at your leisure, what you think of this trouvaille. It is, of course, entirely at your service, if you think it worthy of a place in a new edition of the minstrelsy. I have no room to inflict more ballads or legends on you, and remain, most faithfully, yours, R. Surtees.
From Jonathan Oldbuck, Esquire of Monkbarns, to Robert Surtees, Esquire of Mainsforth. Read by Dialonofka. Monkbarns, June 1st. My dear sir, how kind hath fortune been to you, and in secondary degree to myself. Your letter must dispel the unreasoning, and I fear envious scepticism of Macrib, who has put forth a pamphlet, I love that old spelling, in which he derides the history of Aldobrand Oldenbuck as a fable. The ballad shall, indeed, have an honoured place in my poor collection, whenever the public taste calls for a new edition. But the original, what would I not give to have it in my hands, to touch the very parchment which came from the press of my revered ancestor, and, gloating on the crabbed letters, confute Macrib to his face, ipso visu et tactu, of so inestimable a rarity. Exchanges, or swaps, as the vulgar call them, are not unknown among our fraternity. Ask what you will for this treasure, to half of my kingdom. My gold Aurelius, found at Bermaceti, on the very limits of Roman Caledonia. My complaint of Scotland, the only perfect copy known. My copper plate with almanacs, engraved upon it, and other knacks. My moon dial, with Napier's bones, and several constellation stones. Make your choice, in fact, of all my Gabions, as honest old George Ruthven called them. Nay, excuse the covetousness of an antiquary, my dear sir. I well know that nothing I could offer were worth the tithe of your priceless discovery, the oldest printed Scots ballad extant. It shall suffice for me to look on it, under the roof of Mainsforth, when next I make a raid across the border. I have conquered my passions, and can obey the last of the commandments. Hord equiden in video minor magis. I need not bid you be watchful of your booty. Yours most faithfully, Jonathan Oldbuck.
From Robert Surtees, Esquire, to Jonathan Oldbuck, Esquire. Read by Christine G. June 11. My dear sir, alas, your warning comes too late. An accursed example of womankind, fit descendant of that unhappy Betty Barnes, cook to Mr. Warburton, who destroyed his ancient manuscript place, hath invaded my sanctum, and the original black letter text of the ballad has gone to join Shakespeare's Stephen and Henry II. She hath lit with it my study fire, and it is fortunate indeed that I had made the copy of the ballad for you. But the volume of the Coquillard is alive to testify to the authenticity of the poem, which, after all, is needless evidence, as not even Ritson could suspect of either the skill or the malice of such a forgery. Yours most faithfully, Robert Surtees. Appendix to Chapter 7 of Old Friends' Essay in Epistolary Parody. Note and letter of Mr. Surtees to Mr. Jonathan Oldbuck. No literary forgeries were ever much better done than the sham ballads which Surtees of Mainsforth imposed on Sir Walter Scott. The poems were spirited and good of their kind, and though we wonder now that some of them could take in an expert, it is by no means assured that we are even to-day acquainted with the whole of Surtees' frauds. Why a man otherwise honourable, kindly, charitable, and learned exercised his ingenuity so cruelly upon a trusting correspondent and a staunch friend, it is hardly possible to guess. The biographers of Surtees maintain that he wanted to try his skill on Scott, then only known to him by correspondence, and that, having succeeded, he was afraid to risk Scott's friendship by a confession. This is plausible, and if good may come out of evil, we may remember that 2 picturesque parts of Marmion are due to one confessed, and another certain supercherie of Surtees. It cannot be said in his defence that he had no conception of the mischief of literary frauds. In more than one passage of his correspondence he mentions Ritson's detestation of these practices to literary imposition as tending to obscure the path of inquiry. Ritson gave no quarter, says this arch-literary impostor. A brief account of Surtees' labour in the field of sham ballad writing may be fresh to many people who merely know him as the real author of Bartham's Dirge, the slaying of Anthony Featherstone. In an undated letter of 1806, Scott, writing from Estesiel, thanks Surtees for his obliging communications. Surtees manifestly began the correspondence, being attracted by the border minstrelsy. Thus it appears that Surtees did not forge Hobby Noble in the first edition of the Minstrelsy, for he makes some suggestions as to the Earl of Whitfield, dreaded by the hero of that ballad, which Scott had already published. But he was already deceiving Scott, who writes to him about Ralph Urey, or Lord Urey, and about a Goth, who melted Lord Urey's gold chain. This Lord Urey is doubtless the Lord Urey of the ballad in the later editions of the Bolder Minstrelsy, a ballad actually composed by Surtees. That wily person immediately sent Scott a ballad on the feud between the Ridleys and Featherstones, in which Scott believed to the day of his death. He introduced it in Marmion. The whiles the northern harper root chaunted a rhyme of deadly feud, how the fierce Thirlwalls and Ridleys all. In his note, Border Minstrelsy, 2nd edition, 1808, Scott says the ballad was taken down from an old woman's recitation at the Alson Moor lead mines, by the agent there, and sent by him to Surtees. Consequently, when Surtees saw Marmion in print, he had to ask Scott not to print the agent, as he does not know even the name of Colonel Beaumont's chief agent there, but an agent. Thus he hedged himself from a not impossible disclaimer by the agent at the mines. Readers of Marmion will remember how once near Norham there did fight a spectre fell, a fiendish might, in likeness of a Scottish knight, with Brian Bulmer bold, and trained him nigh to disallow the aid of his baptismal vow. This legend is more of Surtees' fun. The most singular tale of this kind, says Sir Walter, is contained in an extract communicated to me by my friend Mr. Surtees of Mainsforth, who copied it from a manuscript note in a copy of Berthog on the nature of spirits, 1694, 8th volume, which had been the property of the late Mr. Gill. It was not in Mr. Gill's own hand, but probably 100 years older, and was said to be a libro convent, Dunelm per T.C. extract. This T.C. being Thomas Cradock, Esquire. Scott adds that the passage, which he gives in the Latin, suggested the introduction of the tourney with the fairy knight in Marmion. Well, where is Cradock's extract? The original was lost before Surtees sent his copy to Sir Walter. The notes had been carelessly or injudiciously shaken out of the book, Surtees adds. Another editor confirms it, that no such story exists in any manuscript of the Dean and Chapter of Durham. No doubt he invented the whole story, and wrote it himself in medieval Latin. Not content with 2 whoppers, as Mr. Joe Gargery might call them, Surtees goes on to invent a perfectly incredible heraldic bearing. He found it in a manuscript note in the Gwylmis Heraldry of Mr. Gill or Gill. The name is written both ways. He beareth per pale or an arg, over all spectre passant, shrouded sable, he being Newton, of Beverley in Yorkshire. Sir Walter actually swallowed this amazing fib, and alludes to it in Rob Roy, 1818. But Mr. Raine, the editor of Surtees' Life, inherited or bought a copy of Gwyllim, that of Mr. Gill or Gill, and I find in it no trace of such an entry. Lord Derwentwater's Good Night is probably entire by Surtees. A friend of Mr. Taylor's gave him a Tyndale ballad, Hey Willie Ridley, winna you stay, which is also Aut Diabolos aut Robertos. As to Bartham's Dirge, from Anne Douglas, a withered crone who weeds my garden, copies with various tentative verses in Surtees' hand have been found. Oddly enough, Sir Walter had once discovered a small sepulchre cross. Upset, in Liddesdale near the 9-stay in rig, and this probably made him more easily deceived. Surtees very cleverly put some lines, which could not have been original, in brackets, as his own attempt to fill up lacunae. Such are, "When the dew fell cold and still, when the aspen grey forget to play, and the mist clung to the hill." And one reading of the piece would say, it must be genuine, for the confessed interpolations are not in the ballad style, which the interpolator therefore could not write. An attempt which Surtees made when composing the song, and which he wisely rejected, could not have failed to excite Scott's suspicion. It ran, "They buried him when the bonny May was on the flowering thorn, and she waked him till the forest grey of every leaf was born, till the rowan tree of Gramarye its scarlet clusters shed, and the holling green alone was seen, with its berries glistening red." Whether Surtees' brown man on the Muirs, to which Scott also gave a place in his own poetry, was a true legend or not, the reader may decide for himself. Concerning another ballad in the minstrelsy, Old Maitland, Professor Child has expressed a suspicion which most readers feel. What Scott told Ellis about it, autumn 1802, was, that he got it in the forest, copied down from the recitation of an old shepherd by a country farmer. Who was the farmer? Will Laidlaw was employed James Hogg as shepherd. Hogg's mother chanted "Old Maitland." Hogg first met Scott in the summer of 1801. The shepherd had already seen the first volume of the minstrelsy. Did he, thereupon, write "Old Maitland," teach his mother it, and induce Laidlaw to take it down from her recitation? The old lady said she got it from Andrew Muir, who had it "fra old Baby Maplin, who was said to have been another nor a go wren." But we have Hogg's own statement that "Abelins my grandmother was an unco lear," and this quality may have been hereditary. On the other side, Hogg could barely have held his tongue about the forgery, if forgery it was, when he wrote his Domestic Manners and Private Life of Sir Walter Scott, 1834. The whole investigation is a little depressing, and makes one very shy of unauthenticated ballads. End of Appendix. End of Chapter 7.
Chapter 8 of Old Friends. Essays in Epistolary Parody. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Old Friends. Essays in Epistolary Parody by Andrew Lang. Chapter 8. From Nicholas to the Editor of the St. James Gazette. It is only too probable that a later generation has forgotten Nicholas, the sporting prophet of fun, in the reign of Mr. Hood the younger. The little work, Nicholas's Notes, in which Mr. W. J. Prowse collected the papers of the old prophet, is indeed not an edition de luxe, as the aged seer says, with his simple humour. From the paradise of fiction, however, and the paradise of touts, Nicholas has communicated, perhaps to the Psychical Society, the following epistle. His friendly mention of a brother journalist speaks well for the old man's head and heart. The Paradise of Fiction, February 9th, 1888. Sir, my dear young friend, it is 10 to 1 and no takers, that the public, than whom, between you and me, I do not think much of them, have forgotten Nicholas, or even never heard of the prophet. Youth will be served, and it is now between 20 years since he left off vaticinating in fun, during young Mr. Hood's time, of future sportive events for to come, and came to live here with the other celebrated characters of fiction, than whom I am sure a more mixed lot, though perhaps a little gay. It having come to the prophet's knowledge that some of them was writing letters to the St. James Gazette, than which I am sure none more respectable, though perhaps a little not quite so attentive to sportive interests as it might be, he have decided that Nicholas will take up his pen once more as of old. The state of the turf, my dear young friend, since an old but still handsome bird would freely alight, when not warned off, on Newmarket Heath, have caused Nicholas some anxiety. Sir, between you and me, it is rapidly getting no better. Here is Lord, than whom a more sterling sportsman, as good as saying to Sir, than whom perhaps. Did you ever hear of a sporting character called Swindles? and the prophet have been told that it may furnish matter for the gentlemen of the long robe, which in my time many of them was backers of horses. And all along of what? Why, of the inexplicable in and out running of horses, as the Standard says, and as will often happen, you, perhaps, having a likely dark one as you want to get light into a high-class autumn handicap. The days is long past since Nicholas was nuts on the game little lecturer, but still has the interests of the turf at heart, and my dear young friend, if horses never ran in and out, where would be the glorious uncertainty of the sport? On the whole, then, if asked my opinion on this affair, the prophet would say, putting it ambiguous-like, "Gentlemen, when there's so much dirty linen to wash, can't you remember that we're all pretty much tarred with the same brush?" A great politician, which a lot of his family is here, Coningsby and the young Duke and many other sportsmen, used to say as what the turf was a gigantic engine of national demoralization, which Nicholas is not quite sure but what he was right for him, though his language on rather a large scale. Horses running in and out is inexplicable. Why, gents all, which of us wouldn't do it if he had the chance to put the pot on handsome human nature being what it is, especially considering the lowness of the market odds, as you have often and often to be content with? In short, the more you stir it, the more it won't exactly remind you of gales from Araby the Blest, than which a more delightful country, only not to be found on any atlas as Nicholas ever cast a glance at the map, however large. But enough of a subject, than which perhaps one more painful to me. The prophet having often and often in early days been warned off Newmarket Heath himself, and called a disreputable old tout, though only labouring in his vocation. Make a new beginning here, please, printer. It have come to the knowledge of the prophet that his notes are not quite so much read as they once was, partly owing, no doubt, to the book being not so much an edition de luxe as rather a low-lived lot to a casual eye at 4d. The picture outside representing Nicholas rather as having had too much for to drink than as a prominent member of the Blue Ribbon Society, which it did not exist in his period, nor would it have enjoyed, to any considerable extent, my personal or pecuniary support, he having something else to do with his money. Printer, please put in a full stop somewhere here, Nicholas being a little out of the habit of writing for the periodical press. He have also heard that it is proposed in literary circles to start a Nicholas Society for the purpose of printing a limited edition of my works, including my lost treatise of Knur and Spell, on Japanese paper, illustrated with photogravures, they having come in since the prophet's period, though perhaps a little gay. But, my dear though exquisite young friends, is there no better way of rallying round the prophet than this? I have heard, from characters in ancient literature, such as Agamemnon, than whom a more energetic soldier, though perhaps a trifle arbitrary, the prophet have heard, I say, that a deal of liquor used to be poured on the graves of coves like him and me, and that it did them good. This may be the case, and anyway the experiment is well worth trying, though I would say, do not let it be milk, as I gather was customary in early times, as didn't know any better, but if possible, a bottle or two of sherry wine, to which, as is well beknown, Nicholas was partial. He will now conclude, and the prophet hopes that an experiment, than which I am sure one more deeply interesting, will not be deferred. He not much taking to the liquor here, though the company makes up for a great deal, especially an Irish officer by the name of Costigan, than whom a sweeter singer or a more honourable gentleman, and signs himself with gratitude for past favours and kind respects to the editor of The Guardian. Nicholas. End of chapter 8.
Chapter 9 of Old Friends, Essays in Epistolary Parody. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Old Friends, Essays in Epistolary Parody by Andrew Lang. Chapter 9. From the Earl of Montrose to Captain Dugald Dalgetty. Read by Caroline. Whoever has read the memoirs of Monsieur d'Artagnan, a marshal in the French king's service, as they are published by Monsieur Alexandre Dumas in Les Trois Mousquetaires, will not have forgotten that duel behind the Luxembourg, in which, as is declared,
an Englishman ran away from the Chevalier d'Arblay, called Aramis, in his regiment. Englishmen have never held that Monsieur Dumas was well informed about this affair. The following letters of the great Marquis and Captain Dalgetty from the Kirkhope papers prove that Englishmen were in the right. 1640. Sir, touching that I did, to your apprehension, turn away from you with some show of coldness on your late coming, it may be that you but little misread me. But, for that no man is condemned without a hearing, I would fain know under your own hand the truth concerning that whereof a shameful report is bruited abroad even in the Gallo Belgicus and the Fliegender Merkur of Leipzig, namely, that a certain duel lately fought in Paris behind the Palace of the Luxembourg, 4 Englishmen encountering as many musketeers of the French king's, one out of this realm, to our disgrace, shamefully fled, and he, by report, Rittmaster Dugald Dalgetty. Till which, brute be either abolished, and the stain, as an ill blot on a clean scutcheon, wiped away, or as shamefully acknowledged as it is itself shameful, I abide, as I shall hear from yourself, Montrose.
From Captain Dugald Dalgetty of Drumthwacket to the most noble and puissant Prince James, Earl of Montrose, commanding the musters of the King in Scotland. My lord, as touching the brute or fama, as we said at the Mareschal College, I shall forthwith answer, and that peremptory. For this story of the duello, as a man may say, though indeed they that fought in it were not in the dual number, as your Grecian hath it, but 8 soldados, 7 of them gallant men, truly the story is of the longest, but as your lordship will have it, though more expert with the sword than the goose-quill, I must even buckle to. Let your lordship conceive of your poor officer, once lieutenant and rittmaster under that invincible monarch, the bulwark of the Protestant faith, Gustavus the Victorious. Conceive, I say, Dugald Dalgetty of Drumthwacket that should be, in Paris, concerned with a matter of weight and moment not necessary to be mooted or minted of. As I am sitting at my tavern ordinary, for I consider that an experienced cavalier should ever lay in provenant as occasion serveth, comes in to me a stipendiary of my Lord Winter, bidding me know that his master would speak to me, and that not coram populo, as I doubt not your lordship said at St. Leonard's College in St. Andrews, but privily. Thereon I rise and wait on him, to be brief, brevis esse laboro, as we said lang syne. His lordship would have me to be one of his backers in private rencontre with 4 gentlemen of the king's musketeers. Concerning the cause of this duello, I may well say teterrima causa. His lordship's own sister, Milady Cleric, was in question, she being, I fear me, rather akin in her way of life to Jean Drocheils, whom your lordship may remember, for the bailies expulsing her from Aberdeen, she migrated to St. Andrews, ad undum, as the saying is, than like, in her walk and conduct, to a virtuous lady of a noble family. She was, indeed, as current rumour had it, the light o' love or belle amie of Monsieur d'Artagnan, his lordship's adversary. But of siclike, least said soonest mended. I take cloak and sword, and follow with his lordship and 2 other experienced cavaliers unto the place of rencontre, being a waste croft whereon a loon was herding goats, behind the palace of the Luxembourg. Here we find waiting us 4 soldados, proper tall men of their hands, who receive us courteously. He that first gave cause of quarrel to my Lord Winter bore a worthy name enough out of Gascony, that is, arida nutrix, as we said at the Mareschal College, of honourable soldados, to wit, as I said, he was Monsieur d'Artagnan. To his friends, howbeit, he gave sic heathen titles as I never saw or heard of out of the Grecian books, namely, Monsieur Porthos, a very tall man, albeit something of a lourdaud, Monsieur Athos, and he that was to be mine own opposite, Monsieur Aramis. Hearing these outlandish and insolent appellations, I thought it becoming me, as an honourable cavalier, to resent this fashion of presenting, and demurred that a gentleman in the house of Dalgetty of Drumthwacket could neither take affront from, nor give honourable satisfaction to, a nameless landlouper; wherein your lordship, I doubt me not, will hold me justificate. Lord Winter homologating mine opinion, he that called himself Athos drew each of us apart, and whispered the true names and qualities territorial of these gentlemen. The whilk, as may befall honourable soldados, they had reason sufficient to conceal while serving as private gentlemen in a regiment, though disdaining to receive halberds, as unbecoming their birth. He that aligned himself forenenst me was styled the Chevalier d'Herblay, and, the word being given, we fell to. Now mine adversary declining to fight comminus gladio, but breaking ground in a manner unworthy of a gallant soldado, and the place, saving your presence, being somewhat slippery and treacherous because of the goats that were fed there, I delivered a sufficient onslaught, and he fell, his sword flying from his hand. When I had taken his weapon, the spolia optima, as we said at Mareschal College, I bid him rise, and then discoursed him on the dishonour of such a hasty defeat. Then he confessing himself to me that, though under arms he was a young fledgling priest in popish orders, I began upon him with such words on his disgracing the noble profession of arms as might have made him choose to return to his cloister, when suddenly he fled, and, being young and light-footed, robbed me, not only of such cadwalks and casualties as an experienced cavalier might well take from his prisoner for ransom, but also, as now it appears, of my good name, for I doubt not that this musketeer priest, Monsieur Aramis, or l'Abbé d'Herblay, for he hath as many names as I have seen campaigns, was the loon that beguiled with a lying tale the newsman of the Gallo Belgicus. And I have ever seen that an honourable soldado will give the go-by to these newsmen and their flying sheets, as unworthy of the notice of honourable cavaliers, of whom, recommending your lordship for the truth of my tale to my Lord Winter, now with his gracious majesty the king, I am fain to subscribe myself one, and your lordship's poor officer, as ye shall entreat him, Dugald Dalgetty of Drumthwacket, late commander of the whole stift of Dunkelspiel on the lower Rhine. Chapter 10
of Old Friends, Essays in Epistolary Parody. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Old Friends and Essays in Epistolary Parody by Andrew Lang. From Mr. Lovelace to John Belford, Esquire. The following letter must have been omitted from the papers to which Mr. Samuel Richardson, the editor of Clarissa, had access. It was written, apparently, after the disgraceful success of Lovelace's disgraceful adventure, and shows us that scoundrel in company not choice, indeed, but better than he deserved. The society of Mr. Thomas Jones, a foundling. Mr. Jones' admirable wife, née Western, having heard of Lovelace's conduct, sent her husband to execute that revenge which should have been competed for by every man of heart. It will be seen that Mr. Jones was no match for the perfidies of Mr. Lovelace. The cynical reflections of that bad man on Lord Fellamar, and his relations with Mrs. Jones, will only cause indignation and contempt among her innumerable and honourable admirers. They will remember the critical and painful circumstances as recorded in Mr. Henry Fielding's biography of Mr. Jones. Partius junctus cetant fenestras, ictibus cerebris juvenis protervi. Curse upon thy stars, Jack! How long wilt thou beat me about the head with thy musty citations from Nat Lee and thy troop of poetical divines? Thou hast driven me to motto hunting for the comeliness of mine epistle, like the weekly scribblers. See, Jack, I have an adventure to tell thee. It is not the avenging Morden that hath flashed through the window, sword in hand, as in my frightful dream, nor hath the statue of the Commandant visited me, like Don Juan, that rake of Spain. But a challenger came hither that is not akin to my beloved Miss. Dost remember a tall, fresh-coloured, cudgel-playing oaf that my Lady Bellaston led about with her, as maids lead apes in hell, though he more of an ape than she of a maid? 'Tis a year gone. This brawny beefed chairman hath married a fortune and a delicious girl, you dog, Miss Sophia Western of Somerset, and is now in train, I doubt not, to beget as goodly a tribe of chuckle-headed boys and whey-faced wenches as you shall see round an old squire's tomb in a parish church. Wherefore does he not abide at this appointed lawful husbandry, I marvel, but not a whit. Our cursed adventure hath spread from the flippanti of both sexes down to the heathenish parts of Somerset, where it hath reached Madam Jones's ears, and inflamed this pretty vixen with a desire to avenge Miss Harlowe on me, and by the cudgel of Mr. Jones, his Sophia having sent him up to town for no other purpose. De la Tour, my man, came to me yesterday morning with the tidings that the new giant, as he supposes, waits on me to solicit the favour of my patronage. I am in the powdering closet, being bound for a rout, and cry, "Let the giant in!" Then a heavy tread, and looking up, what do I see but a shoulder of a mutton fist at my nose, and lo, a Somerset tongue cries, "Lovelace, thou villain, thou shalt taste of this!" A man in a powdering closet cannot fight, even if he be a boxing glutton like your Figs and other gladiators of the artillery ground. Needs must I parley. What, says I? What, the happy Mr. Jones from the West? What brings him here among the wicked, and how can the possessor of the beauteous Sophia be a moment from her charms? Take not her name, cries my clodhopper, into thy perjured mouth. 'Tis herself sends me to avenge the best, the most injured. Here he fell a blubbering. O Belford, the virtue of this world is a great discourager of repentance. If Mr. Jones insists on the arbitrament of the sword, I was beginning. Nay, none of thy Frenchified blades, cries he. Come out of thy earth, thou stinking fox, and try conclusions with an English cudgel. Belford, I am no cudgel player, and I knew not well how to rid myself of this swasher. Mr. Jones, I said, I will fight you how you will, where you will, with what weapon you will, but first inform me of the nature of our quarrel. Would you blazon abroad yet further the malignant tales that have injured both me and a lady for whom I have none but the most hallowed esteem? I pray you sit down, sir. Be calm. The light is ill for any play with cudgel or sword. De la Tour, a bottle of right Burgundy. Mr. Jones and I have business, and he hath travelled far. In a trice there was a chicken, a bottle, a set of knives and forks, a white cloth, and a hungry oaf that did eat and swear. One bottle followed another. By the third, Mr. Jones embraced me, saying that never had a man been more belied than I, that it was Lord Fellamar, not I, was the villain. To this effect I own that I did myself drop a hint, conceiving that the divine Sophia must often have regretted our friend Fellamar, when once she was bound to the oaf, and that Jones was capable of a resentful jealousy. By midnight I had to call a chair for my besotted challenger, and when the avenger was there safely bestowed, I asked him where the men should carry him. His tongue being now thick, and his brains bemused, he could not find the sign of his N in the noddle. So the merry devil prompting me, I gave the men the address of his ancient flame, my Lady Bellaston, and off they jogged with Jones. Was there ever, Belford, a stranger amoris redintegratio than this must have been, when our Lydia heard the old love at the rarely shaken doors? Me tuo longas perunte noctes, Lydia dormis? Ah, how little hath Madam Sophia taken by dispatching her lord to town, and all to break my head! My fellow who carries this to thee has just met Felimar's man, and tells me that Felimar yesterday went down into Somerset. What bodes this rare conjunction and disjunction of man and wife of old affections? And hath Thomas a foundling too gone the way of all flesh? Thy Lovelace. No news of the dear fugitive. Ah, Belford, my conscience and my cousins call me a villain. Minxes all. End of chapter 10.
Chapter 11 of Old Friends, Essays in Epistolary Parody. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Old Friends, Essays in Epistolary Parody by Andrew Lang. From Miss Catherine Morland to Miss Eleanor Tilney. Read by Rowena. Miss Catherine Morland of Northanger Abbey gives her account of a visit to Mr. Rochester, and of his governess's peculiar behaviour. Mrs. Rochester, née Eyre, has no mention of this in her memoirs. Thornfield, midnight. At length, my dear Eleanor, the terrors on which you have so often rallied me are become realities, and your Catherine is in the midst of those circumstances to which we may, without exaggeration, give the epithet horrible. I write, as I firmly believe, from the mansion of a maniac. On a visit to my Aunt Ingram, and carried by her to Thornfield, the seat of her wealthy neighbour Mr. Rochester, how shall your Catherine's trembling pen unfold the mysteries by which she finds herself surrounded? No sooner had I entered this battlemented mansion, than a cold chill struck through me, as with a sense of some brooding terror. All, indeed, was elegance, all splendour. The arches were hung with Tyrian-dyed curtains. The ornaments on the pale Parian mantelpiece were of red Bohemian glass. Everywhere were crimson couches and sofas. The housekeeper, Mrs. Fairfax, pointed out to my notice some vases of fine purple spar, and on all sides were Turkey carpets and large mirrors. Elegance of taste and fastidious research of ornaments could do no more. But what is luxury to the mind ill at ease? Or can a restless conscience be stilled by red Bohemian glass, or pale Parian mantelpieces? No, alas! Too plainly was this conspicuous when, on entering the library, we found Mr. Rochester alone. The envied possessor of all this opulence can be no happy man. He was seated with his head bent on his folded arms, and when he looked up, a morose, almost malignant, scowl blackened his features. Hastily beckoning to the governess, who entered with us, to follow him, he exclaimed, "Oh, hang it all!" in an accent of despair, and rushed from the chamber. We distinctly heard the doors clanging behind him as he flew. At dinner, the same hollow reserve, his conversation entirely confined to the governess, a Miss Eyre, whose position here your Catherine does not understand, and to whom I distinctly heard him observe that Miss Blanche Ingram was an extensive armful. The evening was spent in the lugubrious mockery of pretending to consult an old gipsy woman, who smoked a short black pipe, and was recognized by all as Mr. Rochester in disguise. I was conducted by Miss Eyre to my bedroom, through a long passage, narrow, low, and dim, with 2 rows of small black doors, all shut. It was like a corridor in some Bluebeard's castle. "Hurry, hurry! I hear the chains rattling," said this strange girl, whose position, my Eleanor, in this house, causes your Catherine some natural perplexity. When we had reached my chamber, "Be silent, silent as death," said Miss Eyre, her finger on her lip, and her meagre body convulsed with some mysterious emotion. "Speak not of what you hear. Do not remember what you see." And she was gone. I undressed after testing the walls for secret panels and looking for assassins in the usual place, but was haunted all the time by an unnatural sound of laughter. At length, groping my way to the bed, I jumped hastily in, and would have sought some suspension of anguish by creeping far underneath the clothes. But even this refuge was denied to your wretched Catherine. I could not stretch my limbs, for the sheet, my dear Eleanor, had been so arranged in some manner which I do not understand, as to render this impossible. The laughter seemed to redouble. I heard a footstep at my door. I hurried on my frock and shawl and crept into the gallery. A strange dark figure was gliding in front of me, stooping at each door, and every time it stooped came a low, gurgling noise. Inspired by I know not what desperation of courage, I rushed on the figure and seized it by the neck. It was Miss Eyre, the governess, filling the boots of all the guests with water, which she carried in a can. When she saw me, she gave a scream and threw herself against a door hung with a curtain of Tyrian dye. It yielded, and there poured into the passage a blue cloud of smoke, with a strong and odious smell of cigars, into which, and to what company, she vanished. I groped my way as well as I might to my own chamber, where each hour the clocks, as they struck, found an echo in the apprehensive heart of the ill-fated Catherine Morland. End of chapter 11.
Chapter 12 of Old Friends, Essays in Epistolary Parody. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Old Friends, Essays in Epistolary Parody by Andrew Lang. From Montague Tigg, Esquire, to Mr. David Crimp. Read by Peter Keeble. The following letter needs no explanation for any who have studied the fortunes and admired the style of that celebrated and sanguine financier, Mr. Montague Tigg, in Martin Chuzzlewit. His chance meeting with the romantic Comte de Monte Cristo naturally suggested to him the plans and hopes which he unfolds to an unsympathetic capitalist. 1542 Park Lane, May the 27th, 1848. My premium pomegranate, oracles are not in it. David with you, my pippin, as auspicious counsellors of ingenious indigence. The remark which you uttered lately, when refusing to make the trumpery advance of half a crown on a garment which had been near to the illustrious person of my friend Chevy Slime, that remark was inspired. Go to Holborn, you said, and the longest bearded of early prophets never uttered aught more pregnant with destiny. I went to Holborn, to the humble establishment of the tuneful tonsor, Sweedlepipe. All things come, the poet says, to him who knows how to wait, especially, I may add, to him who knows how to wait behind thin partitions with a chink in them. Ensconced in such an ambush, in fact in the back shop, I bided my time, intending to solicit pecuniary accommodation from the barber, and studying human nature as developed in his customers. There are odd customers in Kingsgate Street, Holborn, foreign gents and refugees. Such a cove my eagle eye detected in a man who entered the shop wearing a long black beard streaked with the snows of age, and who requested Poll to shave him clean. He was a sailor man to look at, but his profile, David, might have been carved by a Grecian chisel out of an iceberg, and that steel grey eye of his might have struck a chill, even through a chink, into any heart less stout than beats behind the vest of Montague Tigg. The task of rasping so hirsute a customer seemed to sit heavy on the soul of Poll, and threatened to exhaust the resources of his limited establishment. The barber went forth to command, as I presume, a fresher strop or more keenly tempered steel, and glittering cans of water heated to a fiercer heat. No sooner was the coast clear than the street door opened, and my stranger was joined by a mantled form that glided into Poll's emporium. The newcomer doffed a swart sombrero, and disclosed historic features that were not unknown to the concealed observer, meaning me. Yes, David, that aquiline beak, that long and waxed moustache, that impassible mask of a face. I had seen them, sir, conspicuous though their owner be of alien, even hostile birth, among England's special chivalry. The foremost he had charged on the Ides of April, I mean against the ungentlemanly Charterist throng, and in the storied lists of Eglinton. The newcomer, in short, was the nephew of him who ate his heart out in an English jail, like our illustrious Chiv. In fact, he was Prince Louis N.B. Gliding to the seat where, half lathered, the more or less ancient mariner awaited Pole's return, the prince muttered, in the French lingo familiar to me from long exile in Boulogne, "Hist, all goes well?" "Magnificently, sire," says the other chap. "Our passages taken?" "Aye, and private cabins paid for to boot, in the case of the storm's inclemency." The prince nodded and seemed pleased. Then he asked anxiously, "The bird? Have you been to Jamrach's?" "Pardon me, sire," says the man who was waiting to be shaved. "I can slip from your jesses, no mercenary eagle. These limbs have yet the pith to climb, and this heart the daring to venture to the airiest crag of Monte d'Oro, and I have ravished from his eyrie a true Corsican eagle to be the omen of our expedition. Wherever this eagle is, your uncle's legions will gather together." "'Tis well, and the gold?" "Trust Monte Cristo," says the bearded man. "And then, David, begad, I knew I had them." "We meet at Folkestone Pier, 7:45, tidal train." "I shall be there without fail," says the prince, and sneaks out of the street door just as Pole comes in with the extra soap and strop. Well, David, to make it as short as I can, the man of the icy glance was clean shaved at last, and the mother who bore him would not have known him as he looked in the glass when it was done. He chucked Poll a diamond worth about 1,000,000 piastres, and, remarking that he would not trouble him for the change, he walked out. By this characteristic swagger, of course, he more than confirmed my belief that he was indeed that celebrated foreigner, the Count of Monte Cristo, whose name and history even you must be acquainted with, though you may not be what I have heard my friend Chevy Slime call himself, the most literary man alive, a desperate follower of the Star of Austerlitz from his youth, a martyr to the cause of the Chateau d'If. Monte Cristo has not deserted it now that he has come into his own, or anybody else's. Of course I was after him like a shot. He walked down Kingsgate Street and took a four-wheeler that was loitering at the corner. I followed on foot, escaping the notice of the police from the fact, made only too natural by Fortune's cursed spite, that under the toga-like simplicity of Montague Tigg's costume, these millions merely guessed at a cab tout. Well, David, he led me a long chase. He got out of the four-wheeler, it was dark now, at the Travellers', throwing the cabman a purse of sequins, no doubt. At the door of the Travellers he entered a brougham, and driving to the French embassy at Albert Gate, he alighted, in different togs, quite the swell, and let himself in with his own latch-key. In fact, sir, this conspirator of barber shops, this prisoner of the Chateau d'If, this climber of Corsican eyries, is today the French minister accredited to the court of St. James. And now, perhaps, David, you begin to see how the land lies. The promised land, the land where there is corn and milk and honeydew. I hold those eminent and highly romantic parties in the hollow of my hand. A letter from me to Monsieur Lecoq of the Rue Jerusalem, and their little game is up. Their eagle moults, the history of Europe is altered. But what good would all that do to Montague Tigg? Will it so much as put that delightful coin, a golden sovereign, into the pocket of his nether garments? No, Tigg is no informer. A man who is charged at the head of his regiment on the coast of Africa is no vulgar spy. There is more to be got by making the Count pay through the nose, as we say, chanter, as the French say, sing a song of sixpence to a golden tune. But as fortune now uses me, I cannot personally approach his Excellency. Powdered menials would urge me from his portals. An advance, a small advance, say £30, is needed for preliminary expenses, for the charges of the clothier, the bootmaker, the hosier, the barber. Give me £30 for the restoration of Tigg to the semblance of the Montagues, and with that sum I conquer millions. The diamonds of Monte Cristo, the ingots, the rubies and golden crowns with the image and superscription of Pope Alexander VI, all are mine. I mean are ours. More David, more my premium tulip, we shall make the Count a richer man than ever he has been. We shall promote new companies. We shall put him on the board of directors. I see the prospectuses from afar. Universal International Treasure Recovery Company. Chairman, His Excellency the Comte de Monte Cristo, K.G., K.C.B., Knight of the Black Eagle. Directors, Chevy Slime, Esquire, Berkeley Square. Montague Tigg, Esquire, Park Lane. Monsieur Vautrin, L'Ébêche des Prés de Toulon. Monsieur Jean Valjean. The Chevalier Strong, would he come in? Honourable Secretary, David Crimp, Esquire. Archaeological Advisor, Dr. Spiegelman, Berlin. Then the prospectus. The treasure hunting too long left to an individual and uneducated enterprise. Need of an organised and instructed effort. Examples of treasure easy to be had. Grave of Alaric, golden chain of Cuzco, galleons of Vigo Bay, loot of Delphi, Straits of Salamis. Advice of most distinguished foreign experts already secured. Paid up capital, a 6 and as many zeros as the resources of the printing establishment can command. The public will rush in by the myriad, and I am also sketching a disinterested association for securing the rights of foundlings, again with Monte Cristo in the chair. David, you have saved a few pounds. In the confidence of unofficial moments, you have confessed as much, though not exactly how much, to me. Will you neglect one of those opportunities which only genius can discover, but which the humble capitalist can help to fructify? With 30, nay, with 20 pounds, I can master this millionaire and tame this earthly providence. Behind us lies penury and squalor. Before us glitters jewelled opulence. You will be at 1542 Park Lane tomorrow with the dibs. Yours expectantly, Montague Tigg.
From Mr. David Crimp to Montague Tigg, Esquire. The Golden Balls, May 28. Dear Mr. Tigg, you always were full of your chaff, but you must have been drinking when you wrote all that cock and a bull gammon. 30 pounds! No, nor 15, nor as many pence. I never heard of the party you mention by the name of the Count of Monte Cristo, and as for the prince, he's as likely to be setting out for Bologna with an eagle as you are to start a monkey and a barrel organ in Jericho. Or may be that's the likeliest of the two. So stow your gammon and spare your stamps is my last word. Yours respectfully to command, D. Crimp. End of chapter 12.
Chapter 13 of Old Friends, Essays in Epistolary Parody. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Old Friends, Essays in Epistolary Parody by Andrew Lang. From Christian to Piscator. Read by Christine G. Walton and Bunyan were men who should have known each other. It is a pleasant fancy to me that they may have met on the banks of Ouse, while John was meditating a sermon, and Isaac was attentive of his trembling quill. Sir, being now come into the land of Beulah, here whence I cannot so much as see Doubting Castle, here where I am solaced with the sound of voices from the city, my mind, that is now more at peace about mine own salvation, misgives me sore about thine. Thou wilt remember me, perchance, for him that met thee by a stream of delectable mountains, and took thee to be a man fleeing from the city of destruction. For, beholding thee from afar, methought that thou didst carry a burden on thy back, even as myself before my deliverance did bear the burden of my sins and fears. Yet when I drew near, I perceived that it was but a fisherman's basket on thy back, and thou didst rather seek to add to the weight of thy burden than to lighten it or fling it away. But, when we fell into discourse, I marvelled much how thou camest so far upon the way, even among the sheep and the shepherds of that country. For I found that thou hadst little experience in conflict with Apollyon, and that thou hadst never passed through the slough of despond, nor wandered in the valley of the shadow. Nay, thou hadst never so much as been distressed in thy mind, with great fear, nor hadst thou fled from thy wife and children, to save, if it might be, thy soul for thyself, as I have done. Nay, rather thou didst parley with the shepherds, as one that loved their life, and I remember, even now, that sweet carnal song. The shepherd swains shall dance and sing for thy delight each May morning. If these delights thy mind may move, then live with me and be my love. These are not the songs that fit the delectable country. Nay, rather they are the mirth of wantons. Yet didst thou take pleasure in them, and therefore I make bold to ask, how didst thou flee at all from the city of destruction, and come so far upon thy way? Beware lest, when thou winnest to that brook wherein no man casts angle, even to that flood where there is no bridge to go over, and the river is very deep, beware, I say, of one vain hope, the ferryman. For I would not have thee lost, because thou art a kindly man and a simple. Yet for ignorance there is an ill way, even from the very gates of the city. Thy fellow traveller, Christian.
From Piscator to Christian. Sir, I do indeed remember thee, and I trust thou art amended of these grippings which caused thee to groan and moan, even by the pleasant streams from the hills of the delectable mountains. And as for my burden, 'twas pleasant to me to bear it, for, like not the least of the apostles, I am a fisher, and I carried trout. But I take no shame in that I am an angler, for angling is somewhat like poetry. Men are to be born so, and I would not be otherwise than my Maker designed to have me. Of the antiquity of angling I could say much, but I misdoubt me that thou dost not heed the learning of ancient times, but art a contemner of good learning and virtuous recreations. Yet it may a little move thee that in the book of Job mention is made of fish-hooks, and without reproof, for let me tell you that in the Scriptures angling is always taken in the best sense. Touching my flight from the city of destruction, I love that place no more than thou dost, yet I fear not its evil communications, nor would I so hastily desert it as to leave my wife and children behind therein. Nor have I any experience of conflict with the evil one, wherefore I thank him that hath set me in pleasant fields by clear waters, where come no wicked whispers, be they from Apollyon or from our own hearts, but there is calmness of spirit, and a world of blessing attending upon it. And hence can no man see the towers of Doubting Castle, for the green trees and the hedges white with May. This life is not wholly vile, as some of thy friends declare. Thou who makest thy pilgrims dance to the lute knowest better. And for myself, I own that I love such mirth as does not make men ashamed to look upon each other next morning. Let him that bears a heavy heart for his ill deeds turn him to better, but not mourn as though the sun were taken out of the sky. What was the song? Nay, 'tis as good balm for the soul as many a hymn. A merry heart goes all the day, your sad one tires in a mile. He that made the world made man to take delight in it, even as thou saw'st me joyful with the shepherds, I with godly Mr. Richard Hooker, he being then tending his small allotment of sheep in a common field, as I recount in a brief life of a good man. As to what awaits me on the other side of that river, I do expect it with a peaceful heart, and in humble hope that a man may reach the city with a cheerful countenance, no less than through groans and sighs and fears. For we have not a tyrant over us, but a Father that loveth a cheerful liver no less than a cheerful giver. Nevertheless, I thank thee for thy kind thought of one that is not for thy company, nor no nonconformist, but a peaceful Protestant. And lest thou be troubled with apparitions of hobgoblins and evil spirits, read that comfortable sermon of Mr. Hooker's to weak believers on the certainty of adherence, though they want the inward testimony of it. But now falls here a sweet shower, a singing shower, saith old George Chapman, and methinks I shall have sport, for I do note that the May-fly is up, and seeing all these beautiful creatures playing in the air and water, I feel my own heart play within me, and I must out and dape under yonder sycamore tree. Wherefore, prythee, pardon me a longer discourse at this time. Thy friend, Piscator. End of chapter 13.
Chapter 14 of Old Friends, Essays in Epistolary Parody. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Old Friends, Essays in Epistolary Parody by Andrew Lang. From Truthful James to Mr. Bret Harte. William Nye's Experiment. Angels. Dear Bret Harte, I'm in tears, and the camp's in the dust, for with anguish it hears as poor William may bust, and the last of the Nyes is in danger of sleeping the sleep of the just. No revolver it was interfered with his health, the convivial glass did not harm him by stealth. It was nary, he fell by a scheme which he thought would accumulate wealth. For a Moqui came round to the camp, Injun Joe, and the dollars was found in his pockets to flow, for he played off some tricks with live snakes as was reckoned with a competent show. They was rattlers, a pair in his teeth he would hold, and another he'd wear like a scarf to enfold his neck with them dangerous critters, as safe as the saint was of old. Says William, that same is as easy as wink. I am fly to his game. For them rattlers, I think, has had all their incisors extracted. They're harmless as a Southern to drink. So he betted his pile he could handle them snakes, and he tried with a smile, and a rattler he takes, feeling safe as they'd somehow been doctored. But bless you, that serpent awakes. Waken, snakes, and they did, and they rattled like mad, for it was not a kid, but some medicine he had, Injun Joe, for persuading the critters, but William's bit powerful bad. So they've put him outside of a bottle of rye, and they've set him to ride a mustang as kin shy, to keep up his poor circulation, and that's the last chance for Bill Nye. But a near thing it is, and the camp's in the dust. He's a pard as we'd miss if poor Bill was to bust, if the last of the Nyes were a-sleepin' the peaceable sleep of the just. End of chapter 14.
Chapter 15 of Old Friends, Essays in Epistolary Parody. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Old Friends, Essays in Epistolary Parody by Andrew Lang. From Professor Forth to the Reverend Mr. Casaubon. Read by Amelia Chesley. The delicacy of the domestic matters with which the following correspondence deals cannot be exaggerated. It seems that Belinda, whose memoirs we owe to Miss Rhoda Broughton, was at Oxford, while Mr. and Mrs. Casaubon were also resident near that pleasant city, so famed for its Bodleian library. Professor Forth and Mr. Casaubon were friends, as may be guessed. Their congenial characters, their kindred studies, Etruscology and mythology, combined to ally them. Their wives were not wholly absorbed in their learned pursuits, and if Mr. Ladislaw was dangling after Mrs. Casaubon, we know that Mr. Rivers used to haunt with Mrs. Forth the walks of Magdalen. The regret and disapproval which Mrs. Casaubon expresses, and her desire to do good to Mrs. Forth, are, it is believed, not alien to her devoted and exemplary character. Bradmore Road, Oxford, May 29th. Dear Mr. Casaubon, in the course of an investigation which my researches into the character of the Etruscan involuti have necessitated, I frequently encounter the root cad, k2ad, or cod. Schnitzler's recent and epoch-making discovery that D in Etruscan equals B2 has led me to consider it a plausible hypothesis that we may convert cad or cad into cab2, in which case it is by no means beyond the range of cautious conjecture that the involuti are identical with the cabiri. Though you will pardon me for confessing what you already know, that I am not in all points an adherent to your ideas concerning a key to all mythologies, at least as briefly set forth by you in Kuhn's Zeitung, yet I am deeply impressed with this apparent opportunity of bridging the seemingly impassable gulf between Etrurian religion and the comparatively clear and comprehensible systems of the Pelasgo-Phoenician peoples. That cad or cab can refer either, as in quatuor, to a four-footed animal, quadruped, quad, or to a four-wheeled vehicle, a seda, Celtic cab, I cannot for a moment believe, though I understand that this theory has the support of Schrader, Penka, and Bonder. Any information which your learning can procure, and your kind courtesy can supply, will be warmly welcomed and duly acknowledged. Believe me, faithfully yours, James Forth. P.S. I open this note, which was written from my dictation by my secretary, Mrs. Forth, to assure myself that her inexperience has been guilty of no error in matters of so much delicacy and importance. I have detected no mistake of moment, and begin to hope that the important step of matrimony to which I was guided by your example may not have been a rash experiment.
From the Reverend Mr. Casaubon to James Forth, Esquire, Professor of Etruscan, Oxford. Dear Mr. Forth, your letter throws considerable light on a topic which has long engaged my earnest attention. To my thinking, the cab in Kabiri equals cav, hollow, as in cavus, and refers to the Ark of Noah, which, of course, before the entrance of every living thing according to his kind, must have been the largest artificial hollow or empty space known to our Adamite ancestors. Thus the Kabiri would answer, naturally, to the Pateki, which, as Herodotus tells us, were unusually figured on the prows of ships. The Kabiri or Pateki, as children of Noah and men of the great vessel, or cave men, a wonderful anticipation of modern science, would perpetuate the memory of archaic circumstances, and would be selected, as the sacred tradition faded from men's minds, as the guides of navigation. I am sorry to seem out of harmony with your ideas, but it is only a matter of seeming, for I have no doubt that the Etruscan involuti are also archaic, and that they do not, as Max Müller may be expected to intimate, represent the veiled or cloudy dawns, but rather the archaic patriarchs. We thus, from different starting places, arrive at the same goal, the archaic solution of Bryant. I am aware that I am old-fashioned. Like Eumaeus, I dwell here among the swine, and go not often to the city. Your letters with little numerals, as K², may represent the exactness of modern philology, but more closely remind me of the formulae of algebra, a study in which I at no time excelled. It is my purpose to visit Cambridge on June 3rd to listen to a most valuable address by Professor Tösch of Bonn on Hittite and Aztec affinities. If you can meet me there and accept the hospitality of my college, the encounter may prove a turning point in mythological and philological science. Very faithfully yours, J. Casaubon. P.S. I open this note, written from my dictation by my wife, to enclose my congratulations on Mrs. Forth's scholarly attainments.
From Professor Forth to Reverend Mr. Casaubon. Telegram. Read by Amelia Chesley. Will be with you at Cambridge on the 3rd.
From Mrs. Forth, Bradmore Road, Oxford, to David Rivers, Esquire, Milnthorpe, Yorkshire. Read by Avaí. He goes on Saturday to Cambridge to hear someone talk about the Hittites and the Asiatics. Did you not say there was a good Sunday train? They sing "O Rest in the Lord" at Magdalen. I often wonder that Addison's Walk is so deserted on Sundays. He stays over Sunday at Cambridge.
From David Rivers, Esquire, to Mrs. Forth, Oxford. Read by Anna Simon. Dear Mrs. Forth, Saturday is a half holiday at the works, and I propose to come up and see whether our boat cannot bump Balliol. How extraordinary it is that people should neglect, on Sundays, the favourite promenade of the short-faced humorist. I shall be there, the old place. Believe me, yours ever, D. Rivers.
From Mrs. Casaubon to William Ladislaw, Esquire, Stratford-on-Avon. Dear friend, your kind letter from Stratford is indeed interesting. Ah, when shall I have an opportunity of seeing these and so many other interesting places? But in a world where duty is so much, and so always with us, why should we regret the voids in our experience, which, after all, life is filling in the experience of others? The work is advancing, and Mr. Casaubon hopes that the first chapter of the Key to all Mythologies will be fairly copied and completed by the end of autumn. Mr. Casaubon is going to Cambridge on Saturday, to hear Professor Toesch lecture on the Hittites, and some other party, I really forget which. But it is not often that he takes so much interest in the mere modern history. How curious it sometimes is to think that the great spirit of humanity, and of the world, as you say, keeps working its way, ah, to what wonderful goal, by means of these obscure difficult politics, almost unworthy instruments, one is tempted to think. That was a true line you quoted lately from the Vita Nuova. We have no books of poetry here, except a Lithuanian translation of the Rig Veda. How delightful it must be to read Dante, with a sympathetic fellow student, one who has also loved and renounced. Yours very sincerely, Dorothea Casaubon. P.S. I do not expect Mr. Casaubon back from Cambridge before Monday afternoon.
From William Ladislaw, Esquire, to the Honorary Secretary of the Literary and Philosophical Mechanics Institute, Middlemarch. Read by Karishma. My dear Sir, I find that I can be in your neighbourhood on Saturday, and will gladly accept your invitation to lecture at your institute on the immutability of morals. Faithfully yours, W. Ladislaw. From William Ladislaw, Esquire, to Mrs. Casaubon. Read by Karishma. Dear Mrs. Casaubon, only a line to say that I am to lecture at the Mechanics Institute on Saturday. I can scarcely hope that, as Mr. Casaubon is away, you'll be able to attend my poor performance. But on Sunday I may have, I hope, the pleasure of waiting on you in the afternoon. Very sincerely yours, W. Ladislaw. P.S. I shall bring the Vita Nuova. It is not so difficult as the Paradiso, and I shall be happy to help you with a few of the earlier sonnets.
From Mrs. Casaubon to Mrs. Forth. June the 5th. Dear Lady, you will be surprised at receiving a letter from a stranger. How shall I address you? How shall I say what I ought to say? Our husbands are not unknown to each other. I may almost call them friends, but we have met only once. You did not see me, but I was at Magdalen a few weeks ago, and I could not help asking who you were, so young, so beautiful, and when I saw you so lonely among all those learned men, my heart went out to you, for I too know what the learned are, and how often, when we are young, we feel as if they were so cold, so remote. Ah, then there comes the temptations, but they must be conquered. We are not born to live for ourselves only. We must learn to live for others. Oh, not for another. Some one we both know, a lady, has spoken to me of you lately. She too, though you did not know it, was in Magdalen Walk on Sunday evening when the bells were chiming and the birds singing. She saw you, and you were not alone. Mr. Rivers, I am informed that is his name, was with you. Ah, Stop and think, and hear me before it is too late. A word, I do not know, a word of mine may be listened to, though I have no right to speak. But something forces me to speak, and to implore you to remember that it is not for pleasure we live, but for duty. We must break the dearest ties if they do not bind us to the stake of all we owe to all. You will understand, you will forgive me, will you not? You will forgive another woman whom your beauty and sadness have won to admire and love you. You will break these ties, will you not, and be free, for only in renunciation is there freedom. He must not come again, and you will tell him that he must not. Yours always, Dorothea Casaubon. End of chapter 15.
Chapter 16 of Old Friends, Essays in Epistolary Parody. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Old Friends, Essays in Epistolary Parody by Andrew Lang. From Euphues to Sir Amyas Leigh, Knight. Read by Anna Simon. This little controversy on the value of the herb tobacco passed between the renowned Euphues and that early but assiduous smoker Sir Amyas Leigh, well known to readers of Westward Ho. He dissuaded him from drinking the smoke of the Indian weed. Sir Amyas, take it not unkindly that a traveller, though less wide a wanderer than thou, dissuaded thee from a new-found novelty, the wanton misuse, or rather the misuseful wantonness, of the Indian herb. It is a blind goose that knoweth not a fox from a fern bush, and a strange temerity that mistaketh smoke for provender. The sow, when she is sick, eateth the sea-crab and is immediately recovered. Why then should man, being whole and sound, haste to that which maketh many sick? The lobster flieth not in the air, nor doth the salamander wanton in the water. Wherefore then will man betake him for nourishment or solace to the fire? Vesuvius bringeth not forth speech from his mouth, but man like a volcano will utter smoke. There is great difference between the table and the chimney, but thou art for making both alike. Though the rose be sweet, yet will it prove less fragrant if it be wreathed about the skunk. And so an ill weed from the land where that beast hath its habitation defileth a courteous knight. Consider, if this practice delights thee, that the apples of Sodom are outwardly fair, but inwardly full of ashes. The box-tree is always green, but his seed is poison. Mithridate must be taken inwardly, not spread on plasters. Of his nature smoke goeth upward and outward, why wilt thou make it go inward and downward? The manners of the cannibal fit not the Englishman, and this thy poison is unlike love, which maimeth every part before it kill the liver, whereas tobacco doth vex the liver before it harmeth any other part. Excuse this my boldness, and forswear thy weed, and thou lovest Euphues.
From Sir Amyas Leigh to Euphues. Whereas thou bringest in a rabble of reasons to convince me, I will answer thee in thine own kind. Thou art like those that proffer a man physic before he be sick, and, because his pleasure is not theirs, call him foolish that is but early advised. Nature maketh nothing without an end, the eye to see with, the ear to hear, the herb tobacco to be smoked. As wine strengtheneth and meat maketh full, tobacco maketh the heart at rest. Helen gave nepenthe to them that sorrowed, and heaven hath made this weed for such as lack comfort. Tobacco is the hungry man's food, the wakeful man's sleep, the weary man's rest, the old man's defence against melancholy, the busy man's repose, the talkative man's muzzle, the lonely man's companion. Indeed, there was nothing but this one thing wanting to man of those that earth can give. Wherefore, having found it, let him so use as not abusing it, as now I am about doing. Thy servant, Amyas Leigh.
End of chapter 16.
Chapter 17 of Old Friends, Essays in Epistolary Parody. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Old Friends, Essays in Epistolary Parody by Andrew Lang. From Mr. Paul Rondelet to the Very Reverend Dean Maitland. That Dean Maitland should have taken the political line indicated in Mr. Rondelet's letter will amaze no reader of The Silence of Dean Maitland. That Mr. Paul Rondelet flew from his penny paper to a paradise meet for him is a matter of congratulation to all but his creditors. He really is now in the only true monastery of Thelema, and is simply dressed in an eyeglass and a cincture of pandanus flowers. The natives worship him, and he is the first aesthetic beachcomber. Te Alti, the Pacific. Dear Maitland, as my old friend and tutor at Lothian, you asked me to join the Oxford Home Rule Association. Excuse my delay in answering. Your letter was sent to that detested and long-deserted newspaper office in Fleet Street, and from Fleet Street to Te Alti, thank heaven. It is a long way. Were I at home, and still endeavouring to sway the masses, I might possibly accept your invitation. I dislike crowds, and I dislike shouting, but if shout I must, like you I would choose to chime in with the dingier, and the larger, and the more violent assembly. But, having perceived that the masses were very perceptibly leaning to sway themselves, I have retired to Te Alti. You have read Epipsychidion, my dear Dean? And in your time, no doubt, you have loved? Well, this is the Isle of Love, described, as in a dream, by the rapt fancy of Shelley. Urged, perhaps, by a reminiscence of the great Aryan wave of migration, I have moved westward to this paradise. Like Obermann, I hide my head from the wild tempest of the age, but in a much dearer place than chalets near the Alpine snow. Long ago I said, to one who would not listen, that all the religions of the world are based on false foundations, resting on the family, and fatally unsound. Here the family, in our sense, has not been developed. Here no rules trammel the best, and therefore the most evanescent, of our affections. And as for religion, it is based upon me, on Rondelet of Lothian. Here nobody asks me why or how I am superior. The artless natives at once perceived the fact, recognized me as a god, and worship me, do not shudder, my good Dean, with floral services. In Te Alti, vain to look for it on the map, I have found my place, a place far from the babel of your brutal politics, a place where I am addressed in liquid accents of adoration. You may ask whether I endeavour to raise the islanders to my own level. It is the last thing that I would attempt. Culture they do not need. Their dainty hieratic precisions of ritual are a sufficient culture in themselves. As I said once before, it is an absurdity to speak of married people being one. Here we are an indefinite number, and no jealousy, no ambitious exclusiveness mars the happiness of all. This is the higher life about which we used ignorantly to talk. Here the gross temporal necessities are satisfied with a breadfruit, a roasted fish, and a few pandanus flowers. The rest is all climate and the affections. Conceive, my dear Dean, the undisturbed felicity of life without newspapers. Empires may fall, perhaps have fallen, since I left Fleet Street. Alan Dunlop may be a ditcher in good earnest, on an estate no longer his, but here we fleet the time carelessly, as in the golden world. And you ask me to join a raucous political association for an object you detest in your heart, merely because you want to swim with the turbid democratic current? You are an historian, Maitland. Did you ever know this policy succeeded? Did you ever know the respectables prosper when they allied themselves with the vulgar? Ah, keep out of your second-hand revolutions. Keep your hands clean, whether you keep your head on your shoulders or not. You will never, I fear, be Bishop of Winkham, with all your historical handbooks and all your Oxford liberalism. But I'm losing my temper for the first time since I discovered T.Alt. This must not be. Yours regretfully, Paul Rondelet. P.S. Don't give anyone my address. Some of these Oxford harpies are still unappeased. The only European I have seen was not a university man. He was a popular Scotch novelist and carried shorter catechisms which he distributed to my flock. I only hope he won't make copy out of me and my situation. P.R. End of chapter 17.
Chapter 18 of Old Friends, Essays in Epistolary Parody. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Old Friends, Essays in Epistolary Parody by Andrew Lang. From Harold Skimpole, Esquire, to the Rev. Charles Honeyman, M.A. These letters tell their own tale of genius and virtue indigent and in chains. The eloquence of a Honeyman, the accomplishments of a Skimpole, lead only to Cursitor Street. Coavins's, Cursitor Street, May 1. My dear Honeyman, it is May Day, even when the chimney-sweeper, developing the pleasant unconscious poetry of his nature, forgets the flues, wreathes the flowers, and persuades himself that he is Jack in the Green. Jack who? Was he Jack Sprat, or the young swain who mated with Jill? Who knows? The chimney-sweeper has all I ask, all that the butterflies possess, all that common sense and business and society deny to Harold Skimpole. He lives, he is free, he is in the green. I am in Coavins's. In Cursitor Street I cannot hear the streams warble, the birds chant, the music roll through the stately fane, let us say, of Lady Whittlesea's. Coavins's, as Coavins's man says, is a 'ouse. But how unlike, for example, the hospitable home of our friend Jarndyce! I can sketch Coavins's, but I cannot alter it. I can set it to music, on Coavins's piano. But how melancholy are the jingling strains of that dilapidated instrument! At Jarndyce's house, when I am there, I am in possession of it. Here Coavins's is in possession of me, of the person of Harold Skimpole. And why am I here? Why am I far from landscape, music, conversation? Why, merely because I will follow neither fame nor fortune nor faith. They call to us in the market-place, but I will not dance. Fame blows her trumpet, and offers her shilling, the Queen's. Faith peals her bells, and asks for my shilling. Fortune rattles her banking scales. They call, and the world joins the waltz, but I will not march with them. Go after glory, commerce, creeds, I cry. Only let Harold Skimpole live. The world pursues the jangling music, but in my ear sound the pipes of Pan, the voices of the river and the wood. Yet I cannot be in the playground, whither they invite me. Harold Skimpole is fettered. By what? By items. I regret my incapacity for details. It may be the tinker or the tailor at whose suit I am detained. I am certain that it is not that of the soldier or the sailor or the ploughboy or the thief. But for the apothecary, why, yes, it may be the apothecary. In the dawn of life I loved, who has not? I wedded. I set about surrounding myself with rosy cheeks. These cheeks grow pallid. I call for the aid of science. Science sends in her bill. To the mixture as before, so much to the tonic, so much. The cheeks are rosy again. I pour forth the blessings of a father's heart, but there stands science inexorable with her bill, her items. I vainly point out that the mixture has played its part, the tonic has played its part, and that, in the nature of things, the transaction is ended. The bill is unappeasable. I forget the details. A certain number of pieces of yellow and white dross are spoken of. Ah, I see it is 15 and some odd shillings and coppers. Let us say 20. My dear Honeyman, you who, as I hear, are about to follow the flutes of Aphrodite into a temple where Hymen gilds the horns of the victims, you, I am sure, will hurry to my rescue. You may not have the specie actually in your coffers, but with your prospects, surely you can sign something, or make over something, or back something, say a post obit or post vincula, or employ some other instrument? Excuse my inexperience, or I should say, excuse my congenital inability to profit by experience, now considerable, of difficulties, and of friendship. Let not the son of May Day go down on Harold Skimpole in Coavins's. Yours ever, H.S. P.S. A youthful myrmidon of Coavins's will wait for a reply. Shall we say, while we are about it, 25?
From the Reverend Charles Honeyman to Harold Skimpole, Esquire. Cursitor Street, May 1st. My dear Skimpole, how would I have joyed that Providence placed it within my power to relieve your distress, but it cannot be. Like the Carthaginian queen of whom we read in happier days at dear old Borhambury, I may say that I am haud ignaris mali. But alas, the very evils in which I am not unlearned make it impossible for me to add miseris succurrere disco. Rather am I myself in need of succour. You, my dear Harold, have fallen among thieves. I may too truly add that in this I am your neighbour. The dens in which we are lodged are contiguous. We are separated only by the bars. Your note was sent on hither from my rooms in Walpole Street. Since we met, I have known the utmost that woman's perfidy and the rich man's contumely can inflict. But I can bear my punishment. I loved, I trusted. She to whose hand I aspired, she on whose affections I had based hopes at once of happiness in life and of extended usefulness in the clerical profession, she was less confiding. She summoned to her counsel a minion of the law, one Briggs. His estimate of my position and prospects could not possibly tally with that of one whose hopes are not set where the worldling places them. Let him and such as he take thought for the morrow and chaffer about settlements. I do not regret the gold to which you so delicately allude. I sorrow only for the bloom that has been brushed from the soaring pinions of a pure and disinterested affection. Sunt lacrimae rerum, and the handkerchief in which I bury my face is dank with them. Nor is this disappointment my only cross. The carrion birds of commerce have marked down the stricken deer from their eyries in Bond Street and Jermyn Street. To know how Solomon's has behaved, and the black colours in which Moss of Wardour Street has shown himself, is to receive a new light on the character of a people chosen under a very different dispensation. Detainers flock in, like ravens to a feast. At this moment I have endured a humiliation of meeting a sneering child of this world, Mr. Arthur Pendennis, the emissary of one to whom I gave in other days the sweetest blossom in the garden of my affections, my sister, of one who has, indeed, behaved like a brother-in-law. My word distrusted, my statements received with a chilling scepticism by this nabob Newcome, I am urged to make some composition with my creditors. The world is very censorious, the ear of a bishop is easily won. Who knows how those who have envied talents not misused may turn my circumstances to my disadvantage? You will see that, far from aiding another, I am rather obliged to seek succour myself. But that saying about the sparrows abides with me to my comfort. Could aught he done, think you, with a bill backed by our joint names? On July 12th my pew rents will come in. I swear to you that they have not been anticipated. Yours afflictedly, Charles Honeyman. P.S. Would Jarndyce lend his name to a small bill at 3 months? You know him well, and I have heard that he is a man of benevolent character and of substance. But how heartily shall a rich man— You remember the text. C.H. End of chapter 18.
Chapter 19 of Old Friends, Essays in Epistolary Parody. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Old Friends, Essays in Epistolary Parody by Andrew Lang. From Miss Harriet to Monsieur Guy de Maupassant. Read by Karen Savage. This note, from one of the English damsels whom Monsieur Guy de Maupassant dislikes so much, is written in such French as the lady could muster. It explains that recurrent mystery, why English women abroad smell of gutta percha. The reason is not discreditable to our countrywomen, but if Monsieur de Maupassant asks, as he often does, why English women dress like scarecrows when they are on the continent, Miss Harriet does not provide the answer. Miss Pinkerton's, Stratford-at-Bow, Mare 12. Monsieur, vous devez me connaître, quoique je ne vous connais pas le moins du monde. Il m'est défendu de lire vos romans, je ne sais trop pourquoi. Mais j'ai bien lu la notice que Monsieur Henry James a consacrée dans le Fortnightly Review à votre aimable talent. Vous n'aimez pas, à ce qu'il paraît, ni la sale Angleterre, ni les filles de ce pays immonde. Je figure moi-même dans vos romans, ou moi-même, car les Anglais, il est convenu, prononcent ces pronoms comme le nom d'un oiseau monstrueux et même préhistorique de New Zealand. Oui, Miss Harriet se risque assez souvent dans votre conte assez risqué. Vous avez posé, monsieur, le sublime problème. Comment se prénomment-elles les demoiselles anglaises pour sentir toujours le caoutchouc? To smell of India rubber. Traduction Henry James. En premier lieu, monsieur, elles ne smell of India rubber quand elles se trouvent chez elles, dans le bouge infect qu'on appelle les stately homes of England. Footnote. Non, monsieur. Je ne cite ni Wordsworth, ni le vieux Williams. End footnote. C'est seulement à l'étranger que nous répandons l'odeur saine et réjouissante de caoutchouc. Et pourquoi? Parce que, monsieur, Miss Harriet tient à son tub, ou tobe. La chose est anglaise. C'est permis pourtant à un galant homme d'en prononcer le nom comme il veut, ou comme il peut. Or, quand elle voyage, Miss Harriet trouve assez souvent que le tub est une institution tout à fait inconnue à ses hôtes. Que fait-elle donc? Elle porte dans sa malle un tub de caoutchouc, Patent Compressible India Rubber Tub. Inutile à dire que ces vêtements se trouvent imprégnés du smell of India rubber. Voici, monsieur, la solution naturelle et même fort louable d'une question qui est faite pour désespérer les savants de la France. Vous, monsieur, qui êtes un styliste accompli, veuillez bien me pardonner les torts que je viens de faire à la belle langue française. Dame, on fait ce qu'on peut, comme on dit dans les romans policiers, pour être intelligible à un écrivain si célèbre, qui ne lit couramment, peut-être, l'idiome barbare et malsonnant de la sale Angleterre. Monsieur Paul Bourget lui-même ne lit plus le grec. Non omnia possumus omnes. Agréez, monsieur, mes sentiments les plus distingués. Miss Harriet. End of chapter 19.
Chapter 20 of Old Friends, Essays and Epistolary Parody. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Old Friends, Essays in Epistolary Parody by Andrew Lang.
From S. Gandish, Esquire, to the Newcome Independent. The Royal Academy. It appears that Mr. Gandish, at a great age, though he was not older than several industrious academicians, withdrew from the active exercise of his art and employed his learning and experience as art critic of the Newcome Independent. The following critique appears to show traces of declining mental vigor in the veteran Gandish. Our great gallery has once more opened her doors, if not to the public, nor even to the fashionable elite, at least to the critics. They are a motley throng who lounge on press days in the sumptuous halls. Ladies, small boys, clergymen are there, and among them but few, perhaps, who have received the training in high art of your correspondent, and have had their eye, through a lifetime more than commonly prolonged, on the glorious antique. And what shall we say of the present Academy? In some ways things have improved a little since my Boadicea came back on my hands, 1839, at a time when high art and the antique would not do in this country. They would not do. As far as the new exhibition shows, they do better now than when the century was younger, and Portrait of the Artist, by S. Gandish, at 33 years of age, was offered in vain to the jealousy papist clique who then controlled the Uffizi. Foreigners are more affable now, they have taken Mr. Pointers of himself. To return to the antique, what the President's captive Andromache must have cost in models alone is difficult to reckon. When times were cheaper, 50 years since, my ancient Britons in Boadicea stood me in £30. The central figures, however, were members of my own family. To give everyone his due, Andromache is high art. Yes, it is high, and the antique has not been overlooked. About the back view of the young party at the fountain, Mr. Horsley may have something to say. For my part, there seems a want of muscle in vigorous action. Where are the biceps? Where are the thews of Michelangelo? The President is a touch too quiet for a taste framed in the best schools. As to his colour, where is that nutty brown tone of the flesh? But the designs on the Greek vase are carefully rendered, though I have heard it remarked by a classical scholar that these kind of vases were not in use about Homer's time. Still, the intention is good, though the costumes are not what we should have called ancient Roman when the President was a boy, or earlier. Then Mr. Alma-Tadema, he has not turned his back on the glorious antique. The roses of Heliogabalus are not explained in the catalogue. As far as I understand, there has been an earthquake at a banquet of this unprincipled monarch. The king himself and his friends are safe enough at a kind of high table, though which is Heliogabalus, he being a consumptive-looking character in his coins in the classical directory, your critic has not made out. The earth having opened down below, the heads of some women, and of a man with a beard and his hair done up like a girl, are tossing about in a quantity of rose leaves, which had doubtless been strewn on the floor, as Martial tells us was the custom, dum regnat rosa. So I overheard a very erudite critic remarking. The composition of the piece would be thus accounted for, but I cannot pretend that Mr. Tadema reminds one of either Poussin or Annibal Carracci. However, rumour whispers that a high price has been paid for this curious performance. To my thinking, the friends of Heliogabalus are a little flat and leathery in the handling of the flesh. The silver work and the marble will please admirers of this eccentric artist, but I can hardly call the whole effect high. But Mr. Armitage's Siren will console people who remember the old school. This beautiful girl, somewhat careless in her attitude, though she has been sensible enough not to sit down on the damp rock without putting her drapery beneath her, would have been a true gem in one of the old books of beauty, such as the Honourable Percy Popjoy and my old friend Miss Bunyan used to contribute to in the palmy days of the English school. Mr. Armitage's Juno, standing in mid-air, with the moon in the neighbourhood, is also an example to youth, and very unlike the way such things are generally done now. Mr. Burne-Jones, who does not exhibit, never did anything like this. Poor Haydon, with whom I have smoked many a pipe, would have acknowledged that Mr. Goodall's David's Promise to Bathsheba and By the Sea of Galilee proved that his aspirations are nearly fulfilled. These are extremely large pictures, yet well hung. The picture of Abishag is a little too much in the French taste for an old-fashioned painter. Ars longa nuda veritas. I hope, and so will the liberal readers of the Newcome Independent, that it is by an accident the catalogue reads The Traitor, Earl Spencer K.G., The Moonlighters, numbers 220, 221, 225. Some Tory wag among the hanging committee may have taken this juxtaposition for wit. Our readers will adopt a different view. There is a fine dog in Mr. Brighton Riviere's Requiescat, but how did the relations of the dead knight in plate armour acquire the embroidery, at least 3 centuries later, on which he is laid to his last repose? This destroys the illusion, but does not diminish the pathos in the attitude of the faithful hound. Mr. Long's large picture appears to exhibit an Oriental girl being tried by a jury of matrons. At least, not having my Diodorus Scriblerus by me, I can arrive at no other conclusion. From the number of models engaged, this picture must have been designed quite regardless of expense. It is a study of the antique, but I doubt if Smee would have called it high art. Speaking of Smee reminds me of portraits. I miss Portrait of a Lady, Portrait of a Gentleman. The names of the sitters are now always given, a concession to the notoriety, hunting proclivities of the present period. Few portraits are more in the style of the palmy days of our school, just after Lawrence, than a study of a lady by Mr. Goodall, 687. On the other hand, young Mr. Richmond goes back to the antiquated manner of Reynolds in one of his representations. I must admit that I hear his work much admired by many. To me it seems old-fashioned and lacking in blandness and affability. Mr. Waterhouse has a study of a subject from a poem that Mr. Pendennis, the novelist, whom I knew well, was very fond of when he first came to town, The Lady of Shalott. It represents a very delicate invalid in a boat under a counterpane. I remember the poem ran, it was by young Mr. Tennyson, They crossed themselves, their stars they blessed, knight, minstrel, abbot, squire, and guest. There lay a parchment on her breast that puzzled more than all the rest, the well-fed wits of Camelot. The web was woven curiously, the charm is broken utterly. Draw near and fear not. This is I, the Lady of Shalott. I admit that the wonder and dismay of the well-fed wits, if the lady was like Mr. Waterhouse's picture of her, do not surprise me. But I confess I do not understand modern poetry, nor perhaps modern painting. Where is historical art? Where is Alfred and the cake, a subject which, as is well known, I discovered in my researches in history? Where is Udolpho in the Tower, or the Duke of Rothesay and the 4th day after he was deprived of his victuals? Or King John signing Magna Carta? They are done with the red curtain, the brown tree, the storm in the background. Art is revolutionary, like everything else in these times, when treason itself, in the form of a hoary apostate and reviewer of contemporary fiction, glares from the walls and is painted by royal, mark, royal, academicians.
From Thomas Potts, Esquire, of the Newcome Independent, to S. Gandish, Esquire. Read by Anna Simon. Newcome, May 3rd. My dear Sir, I am truly sorry to have to interrupt a connection with so old and respected a contributor, but I think you will acknowledge, on reading the proof of your article on the Academy, which I enclose, that the time has arrived when public criticism is no longer your province. I do not so much refer to the old-fashioned tone of your observations on modern art. I know little about it and care not much more, but you have entirely forgotten, towards the end of the notice, that the Newcombe Independent, as becomes its name, is a journal of liberty and progress. The very proper remarks on Lord Spencer's portrait elsewhere show that you are not unacquainted with our politics, but at the close, expressing, I fear, your true sentiments, you glide into language which makes me shudder, and which, if printed in the Independent, would spell ruin. Send it by all means to the Sentinel if you like. Send your Tory views, I mean. As for your quotation from the Lady of Shalott, I can find it nowhere in the poem of that name by the author you strangely style young Mr. Tennyson. I enclose a cheque for a quarter's salary, and, while always happy to meet you as man with man, must get the notice of the Academy written up in the office from the Daily Telegraph, Standard, and Times. Faithfully, and with deep regret, yours, Thomas Potts. End of chapter 20.
Chapter 21 of Old Friends, Essays and Epistolary Parody. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Old Friends, Essays in Epistolary Parody by Andrew Lang. From Monsieur Lecoq, Rue Jérusalem, Paris, to Inspector Bucket, Scotland Yard. Read by Julia Niedermeyer. This correspondence appears to prove that mistakes may be made by the most astute officers of police, and that even so manifest a Briton as Mr. Pickwick might chance to find himself in the toils of international conspiracy. Translated. May 19, 1852. Sir, and dear fellow brother, confrère, the so cordial understanding between our countries ought to expand itself into a community of the political police. But the just susceptibilities of the old England forbid at this moment the restoration to a friendly power of political offenders. In the name of the French police of surety, I venture to present to the famous officer Bucket a prayer that he will shut his eyes, for once, on the letter, and open his heart to the spirit of the laws. No one needs to teach Monsieur Bucket that a foreign miscreant can be given up, under all reserves, to the justice. A small vial of harmless soporific, a closed carriage, a private cabin on board a Channel steamer. With these, and a little of the adroitness so remarked in the celebrated Bucket, the affair is in the bag, dans le sac. All these things are in the cords, dans les cordes, of my esteemed English fellow-brother. Will he not employ them in the interest of a devoted colleague and a friendly administration? We seek a malefactor of the worst species, un chenapan de la pire espèce. This funny fellow, drôle, calls himself Count of Fosco, and he resides in Wood Road 5, St. John's Forest, worth abode of a miscreant fit for the forest of Bondy. He is a man bold, stout, fair, and paying well in countenance, il paie de mine, conceiving himself to resemble the great Napoleon. At the first sight you would say a philanthrop, a friend of man. On his right arm he bears a small red mark, round, the brand of a society of the most dangerous. Dear sir, you will not miss him? When once he is in our hands, faith of Lecoq, you shall tell us your news as to whether France can be grateful. Of more words there is no need. I remain, all to you, with the assurance of my most distinguished consideration. Lecoq.
From Inspector Bucket to Monsieur Lecoq. May 22. Dear Sir, your polite favour to hand, and contents noted. You are a man of the world. I am a man of the world, and proud to deal with you as between man and man. The little irregularity shall be no consideration, all shall be squared, and the man wanted run in with punctuality and dispatch. Expect him at Calais on the 26th current. Faithfully yours, C. Bucket.
From Count Fosco to Samuel Pickwick, Esquire, G.C.M.P.C., Goswell Road. Read by Anna Simon. 5 Forest Road, St. John's Wood, May 23rd. Dear Sir, when we met lately at the hospitable board of our common friend Benjamin Allen, Esquire, lately elected Professor of Chemistry in the University of London, our conversation turned, if you can pass me the intoxicating favour of remembering it, on the glorious science of chemistry. For me this knowledge has ever possessed irresistible attractions, from the enormous power which it confers of heaping benefits on the suffering race of mankind. Others may rejoice in the advantages which a knowledge of it bestows, the power which can reduce a Hannibal to the level of a drummer boy, or an all-pervading Shakespeare to the intellectual estate of a vestryman, though it cannot at present reverse those processes. The consideration of the destructive as compared with the constructive forces of chemistry was present, as I recollect, to your powerful intellect on the festive occasion to which I refer. Yes, you said, permit me to repeat your very words, yes, Count Fosco, Alexander's morning draught shall make Alexander run for his life at the first sound of the enemy's trumpet. So much chemistry can achieve. But can she help as well as harm? Nay, can she answer for it that the lemon which Professor Allen, from the best and purest of motives, has blended with his milk punch, shall not disagree with me tomorrow morning? Can chemistry, Count Fosco, thus thwart malign constitutional tendency? These were your words, sir, and I am now ready to answer your deep-searching question in the affirmative. Prolonged, assiduous application to my art has shown me how to preserve the lemon in milk punch, and yet destroy or disengage the deleterious elements. Will you so greatly honour science and Fosco her servant as to sup with me on the night of the 25th at 9 o'clock, and prove, you need not dread the test, whether a true follower of knowledge or a vain babbler signs, in exile, the name of Isidor Ottavio Baldassare Fosco.
From Mr. Pickwick to the Count Fosco. Read by Mike Harris. May 24. My dear Sir, many thanks for your very kind invitation. Apart from the interests of science, the pleasure of your company alone would be more than enough to make me gladly accept it. I shall have the enjoyment of testing your milk punch tomorrow at 9, with the confident expectation that your admirable studies will have overcome a tendency which for many years has prevented me from relishing, as I wish I could, one of the best things in this good world. Lemon, in fact, has always disagreed with me, as Professor Allen or Sir Robert Sawyer will be able to assure you, so your valuable experiment can be put, in my case, to a crucial test. Very faithfully yours, Samuel Pickwick.
From Inspector Bucket to Monsieur Lecoq. May 26, 1 a.m. My dear Sir, we have taken your man without difficulty. Bald, benevolent-looking, stout, perhaps fancies himself like Napoleon. If so, is deceived. We nabbed him, asleep over his liquor and alone, at the address you meant to give, 5 Forest Road, St. John's Wood. The house was empty, servants out, not a soul but him at home. He speaks English well for a foreigner, and tries to make out he is a British subject. Was rather confused when took, and kept ejaculating, "Cold punch!" apparently with the hope of persuading us that such was his name or alias. He also called for one Sam, probably an accomplice. He travels to Calais to-day as a lunatic patient in a strait waistcoat, under charge of 4 keepers belonging to the force, and I trust that you have made preparations for receiving your prisoner, and that our management of the case has given satisfaction. What I like is doing business with a man like you. We may not be so smart nor so clever at disguises as the French profession, but we flatter ourselves we are punctual and cautious. Faithfully yours, C. Bucket.
From Mr. Pickwick to Mr. Perker, Solicitor, Gray's Inn. Read by Mike Harris. Saint Pelagie, May 28. Dear Perker, for heaven's sake come over here at once. Bring someone who can speak French and bail me out, or whatever the process of their law may be. I have been arrested, illegally and without warrant, at the house of a scientific friend, Count Fosco, where I had been supping. As far as I can understand, I am accused of a plot against the life of the Emperor of the French, but the whole proceedings have been unintelligible and arbitrary to a degree. I cannot think that an English citizen will be allowed to perish by the guillotine, innocent and practically unheard. Please bring linen, brushes, etc., but not Sam, who would be certain to embroil himself with the French police. I am writing to the Times and Lord Palmerston. Sincerely yours, Samuel Pickwick.
From Monsieur Lecoq to Inspector Bucket. Read by Julie Niedermeyer. May 27. Sir, there has arrived a frightful misunderstanding. The man you have sent us is not Fosco. Of Fosco he has only the boldness, the air benevolent, and the girth. The brand on his right arm is no more than the mark of vaccination. Brought before the Commissionary of Police, the prisoner, who has not one word of French, was heard through an interpreter. He gives himself the name of Pickwick, rentier, English, and he appeals to his ambassador. Of papers he had letters bearing the name of Samuel Pickwick, and on his buttons the letters P.C., which we suspect are the badge of a secret society. But this is not to the point, for it is certain that, whatever the crimes of this brigand, he is not Fosco, but an Englishman. That he should be found in the domicile of Fosco, when that droll had evaded, is suspicious, louche, and his explanation does not permit itself to be understood. I have fear that we enjoy bad luck, and that Monsieur Palmerston will make himself to be heard on this matter. Accept, monsieur, the assurance of my high consideration. Lecoq. P.S. Our comrade, the Count Smalltalk, of the police of manners, police de mœurs, has come to present himself. Confronted with the bandit, he gives him reason, and offers his faith that the man is Pickwick, with whom he encountered himself when on a mission of secrecy to England, it is now some years. What to do? Que faire? End of chapter 21.
Chapter 22 of Old Friends, Essays in Epistolary Parody. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Old Friends, Essays in Epistolary Parody by Andrew Lang. Chapter 22. From Mr. Alan Quatermain to Sir Henry Curtis. Read by Carolyn. Mr. Quatermain offers the correct account of two celebrated right and left shots, also an adventure of the stranger in the story of an African farm. Dear Curtis, you asked me to give you the true account in writing of those right and left shots of mine at the two lions, the crocodile, and the eagle. The birds are stuffed now in the hall at home, the lions each on a pedestal, and the alligator on the floor with the eagle in his jaws, much as they were when I settled them and saved the stranger. All sorts of stories have got into the papers about the business, which was simple enough, so, though no hand with a pen, I may as well write it all out. I was up on the Knobkerry River, prospecting for diamonds, in Omomborombanga's country. I had nobody with me but poor Jim, who afterwards met with an awful death, otherwise he would have been glad to corroborate my tale, if it needed it. One night I had come back tired to camp, when I found a stranger sitting by the fire. He was a dark, fat, Frenchified little chap, And you won't believe me, but it is a fact that he wore gloves. I asked him to stay the night, of course, and in spunned the wagons and lager, for omomborum bungas impis were out, swearing to wash their spares in the blood of the great white liar, a Portuguese traveller probably. If not, I don't know who he can have been. Perhaps this stranger. He gave no name. Well, we had our biltong together, and the stranger put himself outside a good deal of the very little brandy I had left. We got yarning, so to speak, and I told him a few of the curious adventures that naturally fall to the lot of a man in those wild countries. The stranger did not say much, but kept playing with a huge carved walking stick that he had. Presently he said, "Look at this stick. I bought it from a boy on a South African farm. Do you understand what the carvings mean?" "Hanged if I do," I said, after turning it about. "Well, do you see that figure?" And he touched a thing like a Noah out of a child's ark. "That was a hunter like you, my friend, but not in all respects. That hunter pursued a vast white bird with silver wings, sailing in the everlasting blue." "Everlasting bosh," said I. "There is no bird of the kind on the veldt." "That bird was Truth," said the stranger, "and judging from the anecdote you tell me about the Babian woman and the Zulu medicine man, it is a bird you don't trouble yourself with much, my friend." This is a pretty cool thing to say to a man whose veracity is known like a proverb from Sheba's breasts to the Zambesi. "Foide Macumazan," the Zulus say, meaning as true as a yarn of Allan Quatermain's. Well, my blood was up. No man shall call Allan Quatermain a liar. The fellow was going on with a prodigious palaver about a white feather of truth, and Mount Sinai, and the land of absolute negation, and I don't know what, but I signified to him that if he did not believe my yarns, I did not want his company. "I'm sorry to turn you out," I said, "for there are lions about." Indeed, they were roaring to each other. "And you will have a parroty time, but you apologize or you go." He laughed his short, thick laugh. "I am a man who hopes nothing, feels nothing, fears nothing, and believes nothing that you tell me." I got up and went for him with my fists, and whether he feared nothing or not I don't know, but he scooted, dropping a yellow French novel by one Calut Mendes that I could make neither head nor tail of. I afterwards heard that there was something about this stranger in a book called The Story of an African Farm, which I once began but never finished, not being able to understand most of it, and being vexed by the gross improbability of the girl not marrying the baby's father, he being ready and willing to make her an honest woman. However, I am no critic, but a plain man who tells a plain tale, and I believe persons of soul admire the book very much. Anyway, it does not say who the stranger was. An allegorical kind of bagman, I fancy, but I am not done with him yet. Out he went into the dark, where hundreds of lions could be plainly seen making love, at which season they are very dangerous, by the flashes of lightning. It was a terrific yet beautiful spectacle, and one which I can never forget. The black of night would suddenly open like a huge silver flower, deep within deep, till you almost fancied you could see within the gates of heaven. The hills stood out dark against the illimitable splendor, and on every copy you saw the huge lions, the kittens at play, roaring till you could scarcely hear the thunder. The rain was rushing like a river, all glittering like diamonds, and then, in the twinkling of an eye, all was black as a wolf's mouth till the next flash. The lightning, coming from all quarters, appeared to meet above me, and now was red, now golden, now silver again, while the great cat-like beasts, as they leaped or lay, looked like gold, red, and silver lions, reminding me of the signs of public-houses in old England far away. Meantime the donga beneath roared with the flooded torrent that the rain was bringing down from the heights of Umbopobekatanktiu. I stood watching the grand spectacle for some time, rather pitying the stranger who was out in it by no fault of mine. Then I knocked the ashes out of my pipe, ate a mealie or two, and crept into my cartel and slept the sleep of the just. About dawn I woke. The thunder had rolled away like a bad dream. The long level silver shafts of the dawn were flooding the heights. Raindrops glittered like diamonds on every kopje and karoo bush, leaving the deep donga bathed in the solemn pall of mysterious night. My thoughts went rapidly over the millions of leagues of land and sea, where life, that perpetual problem, was now awaking to another day of struggle and temptation. Then the golden arrows of the day followed fast. The silver and blue sky grew roseate with that wide, wild blush which testifies to the modest delight of nature, satisfied and grateful for her silent existence and her amorous repose. I breakfasted, went down into the donga with a black boy, poor Jim, who was afterwards, as I said, to perish by an awful fate. Otherwise he would testify to the truth of my plain story. I began poking among the rocks in the dry basin of the donga, and had just picked up a pebble. I knew it by the soapy feel for a diamond. Uncut, it was about 3 times the size of the Koh-i-Noor, say 1,000 carats, and I was rejoicing in my luck when I heard the scream of a human being in the last agony of terror. Looking up, I saw that on either side of the donga, which was about 20 feet wide, a great black lion and lioness were standing with open jaws, while some 50 yards in front of me an alligator in a deep pool of the flooded donga was stretching his open snout and gleaming teeth greedily upwards. Overhead flew an eagle, and in mid-air between, as I am a living and honourable man, a human being was leaping the chasm. He had been pursued by the lion on my left, and had been driven to attempt the terrible leap. But if he crossed, he was certain to fall into the jaws of the lion on my right, while if he fell short in his jump, do you see, the alligator was ready for him below, and the great golden eagle watched the business from above in case he attempted to escape that way. All this takes long to tell, though it was passing in a flash of time. Dropping the diamond, which must have rolled into a crevice of the rock, for I never saw it again, I caught up my double-barreled rifle, one of Wesson & Smith's, aimed at the lion on the right hand of the donga with my right barrel, and then hastily fired my left at the alligator. When the smoke cleared away, the man had reached the right side of the donga safe and sound. Seeing that the alligator was dying, I loaded again, bowled over the lioness on the left, settled the eagle's business. He fell dead into the jaws of the dying alligator, which closed on him with a snap. I then climbed the wall of the donga, and there lay, fainting, the stranger of last night, the man who feared nothing, the blood of the dead lion trickling over him. His celebrated allegorical walking stick from the African farm had been broken into 2 pieces by the bullet after it, the bullet, had passed through the head of the lion. And as the Ingoldsby legends say, nobody was 1 penny the worse, except the wild beasts. The man, however, had had a parroty time, and it was a good hour before I could bring him round, during which he finished my brandy. He still wore gloves. What he was doing in Omuborumbunga's country I do not know to this day. I never found the diamond again, though I hunted long. But I must say that 2 better right and left shots, considering that I had no time to aim, and that they were really snapshots, I never remember to have made in my long experience. This is the short and the long of the matter, which was talked of a good deal in the colony, and about which, I am told, some inaccurate accounts have got into the newspapers. I hate writing, as you know, and I don't pretend to give a literary colour to this little business of the shots, but merely tell a plain, unvarnished tale, as the Ingoldsby legends say. As to the stranger, what he was doing there, or who he was, or where he is now, I can tell you nothing. He told me he was bound for the almighty mountains of dry facts and realities, which he kindly pointed out to me among the carvings of his walking-stick. He then sighed wearily, very wearily, and scooted. I think he came to no good, but he never came in my way again. And now you know the yarn of the 2 stuffed lions and the alligator with the eagle in his jaws. Ever yours, Allan Quatermain. End of chapter 22.